The Viking village was not the sprawling, stone-built city of medieval imagination, but rather a carefully constructed, tightly woven patch of life nestled against the unforgiving northern landscape. When one imagines a Viking settlement, the mind often pictures dramatic longships cutting through icy waters, but in truth, the essence of Viking society pulsed in the small, smoky communities scattered across fjords, valleys, and windswept plains. A village was not random, it was placed with deliberate strategy. Near rivers, the land offered both a source of fish and an avenue for trade. Close to forests, the timber provided shelter, fuel, and shipbuilding material. Fields cleared from the wilderness offered a fragile balance between survival and starvation. Every placement of every building was dictated by necessity, by the knowledge that a single harsh winter or failed harvest could undo generations of toil. Walking into such a village in the 9th century would strike modern eyes as both alien and familiar. At its heart stood the longhouse, the dominant structure where a chieftain or extended family resided. Built from stout timber beams, reinforced with turf or stone depending on the region, its sloping roof seemed to blend into the landscape, an extension of the earth itself. From its roofline, smoke curled endlessly, for the fire inside never went out. Around it clustered smaller outbuildings, storage sheds, barns, stables, workshops for smiths and weavers, and sometimes smaller homes for extended family or thralls, slaves whose labor underpinned much of village life. The pathways between these buildings were not paved but trodden earth, muddy in spring and frozen hard in winter, carrying the prints of bare feet, wooden clogs, and the hooves of livestock that moved as freely as people. To the outsider, it might have seemed chaotic, but to the Vikings, this arrangement was a living pattern of survival, a balance between human need and the demands of nature. The longhouse itself dominated the experience of village life. Entering its dark interior meant stepping into a world where light came only from the fire pit at the center, flickering against walls blackened by years of smoke. The structure might stretch 40, 60, or even 80 feet depending on the wealth of its owner, and within this hall, entire families, sometimes dozens of people, ate, slept, argued, celebrated, and endured the passing of seasons. Livestock were often housed at one end, their heat providing warmth during the bitter cold, though at the price of stench and disease. The architecture was functional but not without artistry. Carved beams, woven tapestries, or painted shields often adorned the hall, reminders that these were not brutish savages but a people with a deep sense of symbolism and pride in craftsmanship. Yet alongside this artistry lay filth, parasites, and a near-constant haze of smoke that stung the eyes and clung to every breath. Surrounding the central cluster of houses, fields spread outward in strips. These were laboriously carved from dense woodland, cleared by fire and axe, and sustained by backbreaking toil. Fences of woven branches or stone demarcated property lines, though disputes over land were common. Grain grew in modest plots, while livestock grazed in nearby pastures during the warmer months. Beyond these boundaries stretched the wilderness, thick forests, mountains, and seas that could bring both sustenance and sudden death. The Viking village was not a fortress of stone but a fragile island carved into an unforgiving environment, its defenses more psychological than physical. Unlike the castles of later Europe, these villages relied on kinship, reputation, and mobility for security. If raiders came, men and women alike would take up arms, and if survival became impossible, the village might simply uproot, moving to a more fertile or secure location. Permanence was always negotiable in a world where the climate itself was an enemy. Despite their apparent simplicity, Viking villages were surprisingly interconnected. Dirt paths led to neighboring settlements, and waterways bound communities together more than they divided them. The sea, which outsiders feared as a barrier, was to the Vikings a highway. From small villages, men embarked on fishing expeditions, trading voyages, or raiding journeys, returning with stories, goods, or sometimes not at all. These connections meant that even the humblest village bore traces of a wider world, a shard of foreign glass, a Byzantine coin, or a piece of silk traded across continents. Thus, within the mud and timber of a remote Scandinavian hamlet could be found echoes of distant civilizations, proof that Viking life, though rural and isolated, was never cut off from the global currents of its age. The spatial arrangement of these villages also reflected social hierarchy. The largest longhouse often belonged to the local chieftain or landholder, positioned centrally or on slightly raised ground, signaling authority both symbolically and practically. Nearby dwellings housed lesser families, craftsmen, or thralls, forming concentric layers of status visible in architecture and placement. Wealthier households displayed ornate carvings or boasted larger hearths, while poorer families endured in modest, drafty huts. This hierarchy was not absolute, for fortune could change swiftly, but it structured daily life. The proximity of homes also reinforced community bonds, as sounds, smells, and voices carried easily through the thin walls and narrow lanes. Privacy, as we know it, scarcely existed, life was communal, and every action was woven into the fabric of the village. What strikes us today as primitive was, for the Vikings, a marvel of resilience and adaptation. Every building, every fence post, every furrow in the soil represented not only labor but also knowledge passed down through generations. The placement of hearths to maximize warmth, the orientation of homes against prevailing winds, the use of turf roofs for insulation, these were not crude improvisations but hard-earned strategies for survival in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The smell of smoke and livestock, the constant noise of children, chickens, and hammers striking anvils, the flicker of torchlight across damp wooden walls, these sensory details formed the rhythm of life, a rhythm that outsiders often failed to see when they reduced the Vikings to little more than raiders and warriors. And yet, beneath this practical design lay something deeper. The village was not only a place to survive but also a place to belong. It was a physical embodiment of kinship ties, of the unwritten contracts that bound families, neighbors, and generations together. Each longhouse fire, each shared wall, each communal field carried the weight of continuity, reminding its people that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Viking village, then, was more than wood and earth, it was the crucible where identity was forged, where traditions were nurtured, and where the legends that later shook Europe were quietly born among the mud, the smoke, and the simple resilience of everyday life. Inside the Viking longhouse, life unfolded in a world that was both intimate and suffocating, a place where survival, family, and community were bound together beneath a single timbered roof. To step into such a hall was to enter the very heartbeat of the village. From the outside, the building seemed unremarkable, low to the ground, with its turf-covered roof blending into the landscape, but within those walls the drama of daily life played out in smoke, firelight, and constant noise. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, roasted meat, damp wool, and unwashed bodies. Smoke curled upward from the central hearth but rarely found its way through the narrow hole in the roof, hanging in the rafters until it seeped slowly downward, stinging eyes and blackening beams. For the Vikings, this was home, a place of warmth and security, but also of hardship and struggle. Families shared this space with their animals, especially in winter when survival demanded every bit of warmth. At one end of the hall, cattle, sheep, and goats might be penned, their breath steaming in the cold air, their bodies adding crucial heat to the living space. Yet the comfort they provided came at a cost, the stench of manure, the buzzing of flies in summer, and the ever-present risk of disease. Children played and slept not far from the animals, learning early that life was inseparable from the labor of survival. The hearth itself was the center of existence. Around its flames, food was cooked, stories were told, and disputes were settled. Firelight flickered across faces lined with smoke and fatigue, casting every moment in a dramatic glow that made even the mundane feel mythic. Without the hearth, there was no life; without fire, the longhouse was nothing but a cold shell. Meals were humble yet sustaining. Women and thralls labored constantly to prepare food, thick porridge of barley or oats, bread baked on flat stones, fish dried or smoked for preservation, and meat stewed with root vegetables when available. Salted herring, dried cod, and preserved lamb sustained families through long winters when fields lay frozen. On rare occasions, feasts broke the monotony, with roasted pork, ale, and mead shared in celebration of births, marriages, or victories. But more often than not, meals were repetitive, plain, and calculated to stretch supplies as far as possible. Eating together was not just nourishment but ritual, a reminder of shared struggle and the necessity of cooperation. Children learned their place at the table early, waiting for elders to eat first, while slaves and servants often ate last, after scraps had been set aside. The longhouse was more than shelter, it was a workshop, a school, and a stage for social life. Women spun wool and wove cloth, their looms occupying entire sections of the hall. Men repaired weapons, carved wood, and crafted tools by firelight, while children learned by watching, imitating, and assisting with small tasks. Thralls carried out the heaviest and most menial labor, from hauling water to tending animals, always under the watchful eyes of their masters. The rhythm of work was relentless, dictated by the seasons and the needs of survival. During long winters, time dragged slowly, filled with storytelling, carving, and preparation for the next planting season. Yet even in moments of rest, the air vibrated with activity, the murmur of voices, the clatter of tools, and the crackle of the ever-burning fire. Sleep offered little escape. Families lay together on raised wooden platforms covered with straw, furs, and wool blankets, the warmth of bodies pressed close against the cold. Privacy was virtually non-existent, every cough, every whispered word, every movement was shared. The smoke from the hearth hung low at night, and many awoke with eyes watering and throats raw. Fleas, lice, and vermin were constant companions, burrowing into bedding and clothing, biting in the dark. Yet to those who lived within, this was life as it had always been, normal and accepted, the price of survival in a world where comfort was scarce. Despite its hardships, the longhouse was also a place of culture and tradition. Around the fire, skalds recited sagas and heroic poems, keeping alive the stories of gods and ancestors. Elders passed down wisdom, teaching children the customs and laws that bound the community together. Games were played with carved bone pieces, riddles were exchanged, and songs were sung to the rhythm of harp or drum. These moments of storytelling and entertainment transformed the smoky hall into a sacred space of memory and identity. Within its walls, history was not written but spoken, carried in the minds of those who listened and retold it. Disputes, too, found their stage in the longhouse. Arguments over land, livestock, or honor often boiled over within its walls. The head of the household or chieftain presided over such conflicts, attempting to restore balance before feuds could erupt. Honor was everything, and the smallest slight might spiral into years of bitterness if not addressed. Thus the longhouse was both a place of unity and of tension, where community bonds were forged but also tested. Perhaps the most striking feature of longhouse life was its duality, its ability to be both sanctuary and prison. In summer, when the days stretched long and work took people outdoors, the hall felt expansive and welcoming, a gathering place for meals and stories. In winter, when darkness lasted for months and the cold forced everyone inside, it became stifling, oppressive, and heavy with smoke and despair. The very structure that ensured survival also magnified hardship, compressing lives into close quarters where joy and suffering were shared without escape. To outsiders, such conditions might seem unbearable, yet for the Vikings, they were a testament to endurance. Within those timbered walls, children were born, couples were wed, and warriors prepared for journeys across seas. The longhouse was not simply a building, it was the vessel of life, the crucible where bonds of family and community were tested by fire, hunger, and time. Every scar on its beams, every darkened rafter, every patch of worn earth beneath its roof told the story of lives lived fully, if not always comfortably. It was within these smoky, crowded halls that the essence of Viking society was shaped, not only the warriors and raiders of legend, but the mothers, farmers, children, and thralls whose unseen labor sustained them. The daily life of the longhouse was not glamorous, nor was it the endless bloodshed often imagined by those who think of Vikings only as marauders. It was a life of endurance, a delicate balance of hardship and resilience. Within its confines, people forged communities strong enough to withstand one of the harshest environments in the world. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of laughter, arguments, songs, and struggles still seem to cling to those longhouses, reminders of a people who made survival itself into an art. Food was the cornerstone of survival in a Viking village, and yet it was always uncertain, a delicate balance between plenty and hunger, feasting and famine. To live in the north meant to exist in a constant struggle with the elements, where a single failed harvest or a brutal winter could push an entire community to the brink of starvation. Unlike the romanticized image of Vikings feasting endlessly on roasted meat and overflowing mead, the daily diet of an ordinary villager was far humbler, shaped by necessity, the seasons, and the relentless rhythm of farm work. What people ate was less a matter of choice and more a reflection of what the land and sea were willing to give. The foundation of their diet was grain, particularly barley, rye, and oats. These were painstakingly grown in small fields hacked from the forest or cleared from the rugged soil, tilled by hand or with the help of oxen. Bread was coarse and dark, often mixed with ground seeds or nuts to stretch supplies. Porridge, thick and filling, was a staple of nearly every meal, flavored with little more than salt when available. In good years, there was enough grain to make ale, a mildly alcoholic drink that not only provided relief from the monotony of water but also carried fewer risks of disease. Yet grain was precious, and each harvest was a gamble, vulnerable to frost, flooding, or pests. Every loaf baked in the longhouse carried the weight of anxious calculation: would there be enough to last the winter? Fishing and livestock provided crucial protein. Along the fjords and rivers, nets and hooks brought in herring, cod, and salmon, which were smoked, salted, or dried to endure the lean months. In coastal villages, dried cod known as stockfish became a vital commodity, light, durable, and tradable across great distances. Inland, herds of sheep, goats, and cattle gave milk, cheese, and occasional meat. Chickens scratched at the edges of the longhouse, their eggs adding variety to meals when hens were productive. Meat was a luxury, reserved for special occasions or the slaughtering of animals no longer useful for breeding or milk. When the rare feast came, roasted pork, venison, or lamb filled the hall with the rich scent of fat sizzling over fire, a reminder that abundance, however fleeting, was possible even in such a harsh land. Seasonality dictated the Viking table. In summer and autumn, fresh fruits and vegetables were gathered, berries from the woods, cabbage and onions from the garden, wild herbs plucked to season stews. Honey, when found, sweetened food and was fermented into mead. Autumn was the season of slaughter, when surplus livestock was killed and preserved before the cold set in. Winters were another matter entirely. As the nights lengthened and snow sealed off the fields, families turned to their stores: barrels of dried fish, smoked meats hanging from rafters, sacks of grain hidden from moisture and rot. Meals grew repetitive and monotonous, with stews stretching the limits of imagination. By late winter, supplies thinned, and families often faced the grim task of rationing, each meal measured with care. It was in these months that famine stalked the village, a silent threat that could claim the weakest first. When food ran short, desperation forced people to turn to what later historians called famine foods. Bark from trees was ground and mixed with flour to stretch bread. Roots, mosses, and even animal bones boiled into broth became staples when no other options remained. These emergency meals carried little nourishment and often brought illness, but they could mean the difference between survival and death. Archaeological evidence suggests that malnutrition left its mark on many Viking skeletons. Stunted growth, brittle bones, and signs of chronic hunger remind us that these people lived on the edge of scarcity far more often than they enjoyed abundance. Yet food was not only about survival. It was also about identity, status, and ritual. A chieftain's feast displayed wealth and power, with meat, imported spices, and generous cups of mead flowing for honored guests. Such occasions reinforced loyalty and hierarchy, binding the community together through shared indulgence. At weddings, funerals, and seasonal festivals, food was offered not only to the living but also to the gods, left on altars or cast into fire and water as sacrifice. Eating was communal, a reminder that survival depended on cooperation as much as on individual effort. The poorest might eat less, the thralls might be left with scraps, but in times of true famine, everyone suffered, and the bonds of kinship were tested. The labor of producing food consumed nearly every waking hour. Women oversaw much of the food preparation and storage, tending gardens, milking animals, and preserving supplies. Men plowed, hunted, and fished, their survival skills honed against the unpredictability of the northern climate. Children contributed early, herding goats, gathering berries, or learning to smoke fish alongside their elders. Each season brought its own demands: sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and preserving in winter. This cycle of work defined the rhythm of village life more than any raid or battle, for without food, no warrior could fight, no family could endure, and no saga could be sung. Still, there were moments of joy in the midst of struggle. The first fresh berries after a long winter tasted like treasure. The slaughtering of pigs in autumn brought not just food but celebration, as sausages and roasts filled bellies to satisfaction. Honeycomb dripping with sweetness was shared among children like a gift from the gods. Even in famine, humans found ways to take pleasure in what little they had, to savor the taste of survival itself. These fleeting moments of abundance became memories retold through long winters. Reminders that the struggle was not without reward. In truth, the Viking relationship with food mirrored their relationship with life itself, precarious, harsh, but resilient. They endured scarcity with stubborn resourcefulness, found joy in small moments of plenty, and carried forward the knowledge that survival required both labor and luck. Behind the legends of conquest and raiding lay this quiet, relentless battle for sustenance, fought not with swords but with plows, nets, and patience. To understand Viking life is to understand this struggle, for the greatest victories were not won on foreign shores but in the smoky kitchens of the longhouse, where every meal was a triumph over nature's indifference. Work in a Viking village was never optional, it was life itself, the steady rhythm that kept the community alive through bitter winters and unpredictable seasons. Every man, woman, child, and thrall carried a role, and their combined labor gave shape to a society that outsiders often underestimated. The image of Vikings as fierce raiders is powerful, yet those raids were only possible because villages thrived on tireless work, careful craft, and hidden skills that transformed raw resources into tools, ships, and treasures. Behind the swords and longships, there was always the blackened hand of a smith, the calloused palm of a carpenter, and the quiet concentration of a woman weaving cloth by firelight. The blacksmith was among the most vital figures in any settlement. His workshop, often a modest wooden shed near the longhouse, echoed with the hammer's ring and glowed with the light of the forge. Here, iron ore smelted from bogs was transformed into axes, knives, nails, and rivets. Without his work, the village could not hunt, farm, or defend itself. Tools were endlessly repaired, reforged, and reshaped, for nothing could be wasted in a land where resources were scarce. Yet smiths were not merely practical craftsmen, they were held in awe, even suspicion. Their ability to transform stone into steel seemed magical, and legends blurred the line between smithing and sorcery. A village's strength often depended as much on its forge as on its warriors. Carpenters and shipwrights were equally essential. With endless forests around them, the Vikings became masters of wood, carving planks for houses, fences, wagons, and, most importantly, ships. In coastal villages, the sound of axes striking timber often meant a vessel was being born, its curved hull painstakingly shaped for speed and flexibility. These hidden skills revolutionized history. The clinker-built longship, with overlapping planks fastened by iron rivets, could travel rivers and seas alike, allowing Vikings to raid, trade, and explore farther than any people before them. But within the village, carpentry served more immediate needs. From sturdy chairs to storage chests, from sleds to wheelbarrows, wood gave form to daily life, shaping every corner of existence. Children learned early to whittle, carving toys or small tools, carrying forward skills that would one day keep their families alive. Weavers and spinners filled the halls with their labor, producing textiles that were as crucial as weapons. Wool from sheep was cleaned, carded, and spun into thread, then woven into cloth on upright looms that dominated longhouse walls. Women created tunics, cloaks, and blankets that defended against brutal winters, as well as sails for ships, great expanses of woven fabric that turned wood and iron into instruments of conquest. These sails were among the most prized products of Viking craft, requiring months of effort and enormous quantities of wool. Without them, ships were powerless, and without ships, Viking expansion would never have left the fjords. Textile work was grueling, repetitive, and constant, yet it was also the quiet force behind the most legendary symbol of Viking power. Bone carvers and leatherworkers added their own touches to everyday life. Antler and bone, often dismissed as scraps, became combs, buttons, dice, and decorative items, each carved with care and artistry. These objects reveal a society that valued not just survival but beauty in small things. Leather from cattle hides was tanned and shaped into shoes, belts, and harnesses, essential for travel and farming. Archaeologists have uncovered shoes of remarkable sophistication, proof that Vikings walked not in crude sandals but in carefully crafted footwear designed for endurance. Such details remind us that beneath the smoke and mud, there was refinement, a pursuit of quality that belied the stereotype of crude barbarism. Jewelry, too, reflected both artistry and practicality. Silver arm rings, bronze brooches, and glass beads not only adorned villagers but also functioned as currency in a world without standardized coinage. The making of these items required skill, patience, and trade networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Even the humblest village might possess beads from the Middle East or silver hacked from foreign coins, reshaped into ornaments worn with pride. To wear such pieces was to display connection to the wider world, proof that even the most remote settlement was linked to global currents of wealth and culture. Children were apprentices in all of this. From the moment they could walk, they carried water, gathered firewood, and observed the hands of their elders. A boy might watch his father hammer iron into a plow blade, while a girl learned to weave or milk goats alongside her mother. These tasks were not only survival but education, the transmission of skills that defined identity. A Viking child grew up not in schoolrooms but in workshops and fields, their world a constant lesson in craft, resilience, and the dignity of labor. Thralls, though often forgotten in tales of heroism, were an invisible backbone of work. These enslaved people tilled fields, built fences, and hauled heavy loads, their efforts freeing their masters for other tasks. Their presence reflected the darker reality of Viking life. Prosperity often depended on exploitation. Yet even among thralls, skills mattered. A captured blacksmith or skilled weaver was far more valuable than an untrained laborer, and such individuals might find themselves treated with a grudging respect, though never with true freedom. What makes Viking craft remarkable is not only its necessity but also its hidden brilliance. From afar, a village might look crude, muddy paths, smoky halls, rough fences, but within those rough exteriors were technologies and designs that shaped the medieval world. The iron nails that bound planks, the wool sails that caught the wind, the combs that kept long hair free of lice, and the sturdy shoes that carried feet across frozen ground, all were products of skill, knowledge, and patience. These were not luxuries but lifelines, and they reveal a society where survival depended on hands as much as on swords. Work in the Viking village was relentless, unending, and often harsh, but it was also a source of pride and identity. To craft well was to honor family, to ensure survival, and to claim a place in the community. The hammer striking iron, the loom clacking in rhythm, the axe biting into wood, these were the sounds that defined Viking life as surely as the clash of steel in battle. Without them, there would be no longships, no raids, no legends, only silence. In the heart of the Viking world, women carried roles that were far more complex than the sagas of warriors and raiders might suggest. When we think of Viking women, many imagine fierce shield maidens charging into battle, armed with spears and clad in armor, standing shoulder to shoulder with men. The truth, however, was both less romantic and more powerful in its own way. Most women never held a sword, yet their influence was woven into every thread of village life, their authority as vital to survival as the axe or plow. Within the smoky walls of the longhouse and across the fields that fed the community, women commanded respect, endured hardship, and maintained order in ways that outsiders rarely understood. From the moment of girlhood, the expectations placed on Viking women were immense. Childhood was short, and by their early teens, girls were already trained in the domestic skills that would define much of their lives. Spinning, weaving, cooking, preserving food, tending to livestock, and maintaining the household were not simple chores but lifelines. A single mistake in preserving grain or failing to store enough food could mean the difference between life and death for an entire family during the endless Scandinavian winters. Girls grew up under the watchful eyes of mothers and grandmothers, absorbing generations of knowledge passed down not in books but in practice, each task performed with precision born of necessity. Marriage was not a matter of personal romance but of alliance, property, and survival. Women could marry as early as 12, though 15 or 16 was more common. These unions were arranged by families, binding households together in contracts that blended economic interests with kinship ties. Yet within these arrangements, women often held more agency than many of their European contemporaries. A Viking woman retained rights over her dowry, and if her husband mistreated her, she could seek divorce, a remarkable freedom in an age when most women were treated as property. Divorce, though not simple, was publicly recognized, and a woman who reclaimed her dowry could return to her family with her honor intact. This legal independence reflected a culture that valued balance between men and women, even within a patriarchal framework. Once married, a woman became mistress of the household, symbolized by the keys she wore on her belt. These keys were not just practical tools, they were emblems of authority, granting her command over the family's stores, wealth, and domestic affairs. While men labored in fields, fought in raids, or voyaged across seas, women managed the everyday survival of the home. They oversaw thralls, organized meals, ensured tools and clothing were maintained, and monitored supplies with sharp calculation. In many ways, women were the economic stewards of Viking life, their efficiency determining whether a household prospered or perished. The role of women extended beyond the home. Many were landowners in their own right, especially widows who inherited estates from husbands or fathers. Such women wielded influence in community affairs, appearing at legal assemblies known as things, where disputes were settled and laws upheld. Though they rarely spoke in public debates, their presence signified authority, and their decisions could influence outcomes. Archaeological finds of richly furnished female graves, complete with jewelry, household tools, and sometimes imported luxuries, suggest that women of wealth and standing commanded genuine respect. In some sagas, powerful women are depicted as advisors to kings, negotiators, and even instigators of vengeance, their voices echoing through the political and social fabric of the age. But this authority came with immense hardship. Childbearing was a constant shadow over the lives of Viking women, and it was fraught with danger. Without modern medicine, childbirth carried terrifying risks, and many women died young, their lives cut short in the act of bringing new life into the world. Infant mortality was high, and each birth was both a hope for the future and a gamble with death. Despite this, women bore children with resilience, often raising large families while managing their homes with relentless strength. Motherhood was not only biological but also practical, as women trained daughters to carry their responsibilities and prepared sons for the harshness of adulthood. Religious life offered another avenue of influence. Women played crucial roles in rituals, magic, and the spiritual traditions of Norse culture. The seeresses, known as vulvas, were especially revered, women believed to possess the ability to commune with gods and spirits. Wrapped in cloaks adorned with charms and staffs of power, they traveled between villages performing ceremonies, guiding communities, and foretelling destinies. Their authority transcended gender roles, placing them among the most respected figures in Viking society. Even ordinary women held spiritual roles within households, safeguarding charms, conducting small sacrifices, and maintaining the unseen balance between the human and divine. Yet alongside this authority was vulnerability. Thrall women lived in a far harsher reality, stripped of freedom and often subjected to labor, exploitation, and abuse. Their lives were reminders of the sharp divide between the powerful and the powerless within Viking society. Even free women could find themselves reduced to hardship if widowed without property, forced to depend on relatives or remarry quickly to secure survival. Behind the dignified image of women as household stewards and landholders lay countless stories of struggle, loss, and silent endurance. Despite these hardships, the Viking world afforded women a measure of respect that set them apart from many of their contemporaries in medieval Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, manage estates, and even take part in legal proceedings. This relative freedom shocked later Christian chroniclers, who often described Viking women as bold, willful, and dangerously influential. And though the legendary shield maidens remain a subject of debate, there are hints in both archaeology and saga literature that some women may indeed have fought or traveled alongside men, proving that boundaries, while firm, were not unbreakable. The image of Viking women, then, is one of contrasts: strength and vulnerability, power and peril, endurance and fragility. They were not simply wives and mothers, nor were they mythical warriors beyond history. They were the keepers of the hearth, the guardians of wealth, the teachers of children, the negotiators of alliances, and sometimes the spiritual voices of entire communities. In their daily labor and quiet authority, they sustained Viking life far more than any raid or battle ever could. Within the smoky confines of the longhouse, a woman's voice directed the rhythm of survival. Beyond its walls, her influence stretched across fields, estates, and even into the laws that governed society. And though history has often remembered Viking men for their conquests abroad, it was Viking women who ensured that villages endured, that families survived, and that the culture itself was preserved through generations. To understand their role is to understand the true foundation of Viking life, a foundation built not only on strength of arms but on the resilience, authority, and endurance of women who shaped their world in ways both visible and hidden. Childhood in a Viking village was a fleeting season, short and often harsh, where the innocence of play was quickly tempered by the weight of survival. To be born into the smoky darkness of a longhouse was to inherit both love and struggle, for every child carried the hopes of family and community in a world where death lurked close at hand. In the sagas, we read of mighty warriors and cunning chieftains, but behind each of these figures lay a childhood shaped by the rhythms of village life, the sting of cold winters, and the early lessons of labor and responsibility. From their first days, Viking children lived surrounded by both danger and care. Infancy was a perilous stage, with disease, malnutrition, and accidents claiming many lives before a child could even walk. Archaeological remains show heartbreakingly high infant mortality rates, a grim reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Mothers bore children at great risk, and families often lost little ones before their names were ever remembered in sagas or songs. Yet for those who survived those fragile years, life was full of learning, discovery, and a gradual initiation into the community's work. Play was not absent, but it was rarely aimless. Children amused themselves with carved wooden toys, miniature ships, and bone dice, imitating the roles of adults they watched daily. Girls practiced with small looms and dolls dressed in scraps of wool, while boys carved tiny swords or practiced with makeshift bows. Games taught them skills, strategy, hand-eye coordination, and resilience. Storytelling also shaped young minds. Around the fire, children listened wide-eyed as elders recited sagas of gods and heroes, absorbing values of bravery, loyalty, and cunning long before they could wield tools or weapons. These tales were more than entertainment, they were lessons in identity, shaping a sense of belonging to a culture both proud and unyielding. Work came early, for every pair of hands mattered in a Viking village. Boys were expected to herd goats, fetch water, and assist fathers in fields or workshops. Girls learned to milk animals, weave, and cook alongside their mothers. Thrall children, born into slavery, labored hardest, their youth consumed by chores for masters they could never hope to equal. By the age of 7 or 8, most children were already competent in tasks that ensured their family survival. Childhood was not a prolonged stage of innocence, but a brief prelude to the duties of adulthood. Education was practical, but it was also moral. Children were taught the laws and customs of their people, lessons in honor, hospitality, and respect for kin. Boys in particular were instructed in the use of weapons from an early age. Wooden swords, spears, and shields introduced them to the skills they would one day need in earnest. By adolescence, they joined men in hunting or fishing expeditions, proving their worth in real danger. Girls, too, carried immense responsibilities, often running households when mothers were ill or absent, learning to manage stores and thralls with a sense of authority. Every lesson, every task, was a step toward adulthood, each child molded not only by parents but by the expectations of the entire community. Rites of passage marked the transition from childhood to maturity. For boys, the moment came when they could wield a real weapon, hunt their first animal, or sail on their first voyage. For girls, marriage was often the threshold, binding them into new households where they assumed the roles of wife, mother, and manager. These thresholds arrived early by modern standards. By their mid-teens, many Viking youths were considered full adults, their childhoods condensed into brief years of preparation. The sagas are filled with accounts of young men barely into their 20s leading raids, or young women commanding households with authority beyond their age. Despite the hardships, children were cherished. Burial sites reveal small graves filled with toys, beads, and tokens of affection, evidence that families grieved deeply for lost sons and daughters. Parents hoped not only for survival but for legacy, that their children would carry their names, lands, and stories forward. A child's laughter in a smoky hall, a boy's first successful catch of fish, or a girl's first woven cloth, these moments were celebrated, cherished in ways that transcended the harshness of their world. Still, the shadow of death was never far away. Famine, disease, accidents, and violence claimed young lives with terrifying regularity. For those who survived, resilience was ingrained. They grew quickly into the roles demanded of them, tempered by hardship into the men and women who would shape the Viking Age. Childhood in the North was brief, demanding, and often cruel, but it was also the crucible in which the values of courage, loyalty, and endurance were instilled. To understand the Viking child is to see the hidden side of their society. Behind the warriors and explorers remembered in history were once barefoot children running across muddy village paths, practicing sword strikes with wooden sticks, or whispering sagas to each other before sleep. They were the silent generations that ensured survival, carrying forward skills and stories, enduring loss and hardship, and growing into the adults who would sail the seas and carve their legends across the world. In their short, demanding childhoods lay the foundations of everything the Viking Age would become. Faith in the Viking world was not confined to temples or sermons, it was woven into every breath, every harvest, every storm at sea, and every flicker of firelight in the longhouse. To live in a Viking village was to exist in a universe filled with gods, spirits, and unseen forces that could bless or destroy with equal ease. Religion was not a distant philosophy but a lived reality, a daily negotiation with the divine, where rituals, sacrifices, and superstitions guided the rhythm of life. It was a faith both awe-inspiring and terrifying, rooted in the grandeur of myth and the intimacy of everyday practice. At the center of Viking belief stood a pantheon of gods, each reflecting aspects of human existence and the natural world. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, loomed as the relentless seeker of knowledge, feared and revered for his cunning. Thor, with his hammer Mjolnir, was the protector of farmers and families, the divine shield against chaos, storms, and the frost giants lurking at the edge of creation. Freyja, goddess of fertility and love, governed not only passion but the prosperity of fields and families. Freyr promised abundance in harvest and livestock, while Loki embodied mischief and disruption, a reminder that even the gods themselves carried flaws. These deities were not abstract symbols, they were living presences invoked in daily speech, honored in rituals, and feared in dreams. Yet the worship of these gods was rarely confined to grand temples. In villages, faith unfolded in small acts, offerings left at stone altars, carved wooden idols tucked into sacred groves, or charms worn around the neck. Farmers sprinkled ale or blood on fields to bless the soil before planting. Fishermen murmured prayers to Njord, god of the sea, before casting their nets. Mothers tied protective amulets around their children's necks, hoping to ward off sickness and misfortune. These acts of devotion were personal, woven into the tasks of survival. For the Vikings, the divine was not separate from the mundane, it was present in every furrow of land, every gust of wind, and every flickering shadow at the edge of the forest. Rituals were both communal and deeply symbolic. Seasonal festivals marked the cycles of life and death, ensuring harmony between people and the gods. At Yule, during the darkest days of winter, feasts and sacrifices honored the returning sun, while families gathered to invoke protection for the year ahead. At harvest, offerings of grain, livestock, or crafted goods were given to secure abundance. Sacrifices ranged from simple offerings of food and drink to the blood of animals, splashed upon sacred stones or smeared across idols. The most dramatic accounts, preserved in chronicles of horrified Christian observers, describe human sacrifices, thralls or captives offered to Odin or buried with chieftains to accompany them into the afterlife. While the scale and frequency of such rituals remain debated, they reveal the depth of Viking conviction that life and death were inseparably bound to the will of the gods. Within this religious landscape, certain women held extraordinary power. The Valvas, seeresses of fate, wandered from village to village, wrapped in cloaks and carrying staffs adorned with charms. They were believed to commune with spirits, weave the threads of destiny, and see glimpses of the future. Communities treated them with reverence and fear, for their words could alter decisions of war, travel, and marriage. To invite a Valva was to invite both wisdom and danger, for her presence reminded all that unseen forces ruled human lives. In their rituals, they chanted, entered trance-like states, and performed acts of magic that blurred the line between faith and sorcery. For ordinary villagers, the Valva embodied the raw spiritual energy of their world, a woman standing at the crossroads of gods and men. Superstitions filled the gaps between ritual and reality. The Vikings lived in a world where danger lurked everywhere, and so they sought protection through countless charms and taboos. The runes, carved into wood, bone, or stone, were more than letters, they were magical signs that carried power when inscribed with intention. Warriors etched runes onto swords to ensure victory, farmers carved them onto tools for good harvests, and women wove them into cloth to guard loved ones from harm. Everyday actions carried superstitions: never step over a person lying down, for it might stunt their growth; never leave a fire untended, for it might invite wandering spirits. Animals, too, bore omens. The howl of wolves at night might signal misfortune, while the sudden flight of ravens was seen as Odin's watchful gaze. Death was a profound moment of ritual, for it marked not only the end of life but the beginning of another journey. The Vikings believed in multiple afterlives, each reflecting the deeds of the deceased. Warriors who died bravely might be taken to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where endless feasting and preparation for the final battle awaited. Others might go to Folkvangr, Freyja's field of the slain, or to Hel, a colder and quieter realm governed by the goddess of the same name. Burials reflected these beliefs. Some were laid in graves with weapons, jewelry, and tools for the next life. Others were set adrift in boats, their journey symbolized by the vessel carrying them into eternity. In rare and dramatic cases, entire ships were buried, filled with the possessions and even the retainers of a powerful chieftain. Such rituals reveal a society where death was never simple, it was a passage accompanied by reverence, fear, and sometimes violence. The arrival of Christianity in the Viking world brought new tensions to this spiritual fabric. Traders and missionaries introduced the cross alongside coins and goods, and over time, villages found themselves caught between old gods and new faith. Some converted willingly, hoping for divine favor or political advantage. Others resisted fiercely, clinging to Odin and Thor as protectors of their way of life. For a time, the two faiths coexisted uneasily, with crosses worn beside hammer amulets, and prayers whispered to both Christ and the old gods. Yet even as Christianity spread, many pagan rituals and superstitions lingered, embedded so deeply in daily life that they could not be erased. The blend of old and new faiths created a unique spiritual landscape, one where hidden superstitions continued to shape lives even under the shadow of a foreign god. Faith, for the Vikings, was not a matter of abstract belief but of survival, identity, and connection to forces beyond human control. Their rituals bound communities together, their superstitions shaped every decision, and their gods gave meaning to the struggles of existence. To live in a Viking village was to walk in constant awareness of the sacred and the unseen, to see every storm, every birth, every death as part of a cosmic drama that stretched from the hearth fire to the stars. And in that drama, faith was both a comfort and a terror, a guiding hand and an ever-present reminder that the world was vast, mysterious, and filled with powers that no mortal could ever fully command. Law in a Viking village was not hidden away in dusty scrolls or guarded by cloistered judges. It was spoken aloud, remembered in stories, and carried in the voices of men gathered beneath the open sky. The Vikings lived in a world without prisons or professional police, yet they maintained a legal system that was both practical and surprisingly democratic, even as it could descend into brutality and blood. Justice in the North was rooted in honor, balance, and retribution, concepts that could preserve peace or ignite feuds depending on how they were handled. To live in a Viking community was to understand that law was not distant, it was the thread that held survival together in a fragile society where kinship, wealth, and reputation meant everything. The foundation of justice lay in the Thing, the assembly where free men gathered to decide disputes, pass judgments, and declare laws. These gatherings were as much social occasions as legal events, drawing entire communities to a field or clearing marked by ancient stones. Here, beneath the gaze of gods and ancestors, disputes over land, theft, violence, or honor were laid before the assembly. Law speakers, men trained to memorize vast codes of oral law, recited precedents and rulings, their words binding the community to its traditions. Decisions were not simply imposed from above but debated, argued, and negotiated, reflecting a society where consensus mattered as much as authority. For many offenses, the goal was compensation rather than punishment. If a man stole cattle, he might repay with livestock or silver. If one killed another, the family of the victim could demand wergild, man price, an agreed payment reflecting the value of the lost life. This system of fines prevented endless cycles of revenge and allowed disputes to be settled without bloodshed. Yet it was not always so simple. If wergild was refused, or if an insult to honor was considered too grave, feuds could erupt, stretching across generations, entangling entire families in violence that could only end when one side was utterly destroyed or finally reconciled through marriage or wealth. Exile was another tool of justice. A man declared an outlaw lost the protection of the law itself. He could no longer live among his people, attend the Thing, or claim safety in his community. To be outlawed was a fate nearly as harsh as death, for it marked one as fair game for vengeance. Outlaws wandered as fugitives, surviving on the margins, their names whispered as warnings. The threat of such a sentence kept many in line, for even the bravest warrior feared the loneliness of being cut off from kin and community. But Viking justice could also be merciless. Crimes considered unforgivable, such as treachery, oath-breaking, or particularly violent killings, sometimes brought execution. Hanging, drowning, or beheading were known punishments, carried out swiftly and often publicly to reinforce the seriousness of the crime. For thralls, the enslaved who had no legal standing, punishments could be even harsher, their lives treated as property to be taken without consequence. Brutality was a language of authority, a reminder that in a world where survival was tenuous, order could not always be maintained with fines and words alone. The sagas, written centuries later, speak of punishments so horrific they linger in imagination. Among them is the infamous blood eagle, a ritualized execution said to involve cutting open the victim's back and spreading the ribs like wings. Scholars still debate whether it was ever truly practiced or whether it was myth meant to terrify. Yet its very presence in the literature speaks to the fear and fascination with violence in Viking culture, a people who lived close to death and were unflinching in their depictions of it. Even if such extremes were rare or symbolic, they reflected a society where law was intertwined with spectacle, meant to preserve order through awe as much as through fairness. Justice was also deeply tied to gender and status. Wealthy landowners could pay fines that poor men could never afford. A chieftain's word carried more weight than a farmer's, and women, though they held property rights, were often represented at assemblies by male kin. Yet women were not voiceless. A widow could demand wergild for her husband's death, and sagas record instances where women incited vengeance or pressured men to pursue justice when honor was at stake. The system, while hierarchical, allowed room for influence from unexpected quarters, weaving law into the broader fabric of kinship and reputation. Religion and superstition often crept into matters of law. Oaths were sworn before gods, their violation considered both a legal and spiritual crime. Trials by ordeal sometimes tested guilt through dangerous tasks, such as retrieving stones from boiling water or walking over hot iron, the outcome left to divine judgment. These rituals reflected a worldview where human justice alone was insufficient, where the gods themselves were called upon to reveal truth. In such moments, law became a sacred act, binding the living to powers beyond their control. For all its harshness, the Viking legal system provided stability in a dangerous world. It offered a framework for resolving disputes, balancing retribution with compromise, and channeling violence into socially sanctioned forms. Without it, communities could have dissolved into chaos, consumed by endless feuds and rivalries. Instead, law created a fragile order, one that allowed villages to function, trade to flourish, and even raiding expeditions to be organized with agreed shares of plunder and responsibility. Justice, then, was not a luxury but a necessity, a survival strategy for a people who lived on the edge of the known world. To walk through a Viking village was to sense the weight of this order in every interaction. Neighbors greeted each other with careful respect, aware that a single insult could spark a feud. Families calculated their alliances, knowing that kinship ties might mean the difference between safety and vulnerability. The thing was not just a court but a mirror of the community's soul, reflecting its values of honor, balance, and fear of chaos. And though justice could be harsh, even brutal, it was also deeply human, a system born not of cruelty for its own sake but of the desperate need to hold society together against the constant threats of hunger, violence, and fate. When most people think of the Vikings, they picture fire on the horizon, longships slicing through the mist, and villages far away burned to ash. But behind every raid and every warrior who crossed the sea, there was a small community at home that made such expeditions possible. War and raiding may have defined the reputation of the Norse abroad, but in truth they were deeply rooted in the quiet rhythms of village life. Without the support of farmers, craftsmen, women, and children, no longship would have sailed, no sword would have been sharpened, and no saga of conquest would ever have been told. The decision to raid was never casual. It required planning, resources, and the cooperation of entire households. Men who sought plunder first had to ensure their families and farms would not collapse in their absence. This meant that women often took on even greater responsibilities at home, managing livestock, fields, and households for weeks or months while their husbands, brothers, or sons were away. The departure of warriors left villages vulnerable, so communities relied on cooperation and trust, with neighbors watching over one another's property. To the outsider, a raiding voyage might seem an act of wild violence, but in reality it was a carefully calculated gamble, dependent on the labor and loyalty of those who stayed behind. Preparation began long before a ship ever touched the water. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly to forge weapons, swords, spears, axes, and arrowheads. Carpenters and shipwrights repaired hulls, carved oars, and shaped the curved planks that gave the longships their speed and strength. Weavers produced sails of immense size, their months of toil creating the very engines of Viking expansion. Leatherworkers crafted shields, belts, and boots that would withstand the strain of battle and voyage alike. Every hammer strike, every thread pulled tight on a loom, every rivet driven into timber was an invisible act of war, carried out not on the battlefield but in the workshop. For the warriors themselves, preparation was as much spiritual as practical. Before departure, rituals were held to secure favor from the gods. Sacrifices of animals, or, in rare and dramatic accounts, even human lives, were offered to Odin or Thor, prayers murmured for victory, safe passage, and a glorious return. Amulets of Thor's hammer hung from necks, runes were carved into blades, and charms were tied onto ships. The journey ahead was uncertain, and even the fiercest warrior understood that fate was never entirely in his hands. Faith, ritual, and superstition accompanied every sword packed and every oar lifted into the sea. The village gathered to watch the longships depart, the entire community invested in the outcome. Wives and children stood on the shore as oars dipped into water, waving farewell with equal parts pride and dread. The absence of so many men created a silence in the village that was as heavy as the clamor of battle abroad. Daily life continued, but always with the question, would they return, and if they did, would it be with wealth, or with only stories carried by survivors? Every raid was not just the venture of a few warriors but the collective risk of an entire community. When raiders returned, the village became a stage of triumph or tragedy. Ships heavy with silver, livestock, slaves, and exotic goods transformed the community overnight. Foreign coins were hacked into pieces and worn as jewelry, silks were stitched into clothing, and glass beads glittered in the hair of women and children. These treasures elevated the status of those who brought them home, strengthening their households and binding followers with gifts. But alongside wealth came slaves, thralls captured in raids, who were forced into labor, altering the dynamics of daily life in the village. For some, the return of a raiding party meant sudden prosperity; for others, it brought grief, as the empty place at a hearth fire reminded them that a father, brother, or son would never come home. The cycle of raiding created deep contrasts in Viking society. On one hand, it offered opportunity; young men could prove their bravery, earn wealth, and rise in status beyond what farming alone allowed. On the other, it exposed villages to instability, their survival dependent on the fortunes of distant battles. Not every raid was successful; storms claimed ships, enemies struck back, and sometimes men returned with nothing but scars. In such cases, the burden fell again on the village, which had to absorb the loss and continue its relentless work of survival. The glory of Viking warfare was built on the quiet resilience of those who never held a sword but still bore the consequences of battle. Training for war began within the village itself. Boys practiced with wooden swords, learning to fight not as individuals but as part of a shield wall, a tactic that required trust and discipline. Older men taught them to wield axes and spears, while hunters prepared them with skills of patience and accuracy. The line between daily labor and combat was thin, for the same strength used to swing an axe at a tree could be turned against an enemy. In this way, every village was a training ground, shaping its sons into warriors who carried the identity of their home into faraway lands. Yet not all connections between village and raid were martial. Trade often blended with raiding, and ships returned not only with plunder but with goods bought or exchanged. A silver coin from Baghdad, a piece of silk from Byzantium, or spices from the east might find its way into the most modest settlement. These items served as proof that their men had ventured far and returned, linking the smallest communities of Scandinavia to the vast networks of Europe and beyond. In the longhouse, these objects sparked wonder, symbols of both wealth and the reach of the world beyond the fjords. War and raiding, then, were never separate from the Viking village. They were threads in the same fabric, binding home and battlefield together in ways often unseen. The reputation of the Vikings as fearsome raiders was forged not only in monasteries set aflame but in the smoky workshops, the looms, the kitchens, and the quiet endurance of those who stayed behind. Every raid carried the imprint of a community that had labored, sacrificed, and hoped. Every longship launched from the shore was the culmination of countless unseen hands and voices. To understand Viking warfare is not to look only at the battlefield, but to stand in the village that gave it life, where war was both a distant thunder and an ever-present shadow cast across daily survival. Though the Vikings are often remembered as raiders, their legacy was built just as much on trade and travel as it was on blood and conquest. For every monastery plundered on a foreign shore, there were dozens of journeys where goods were exchanged, stories shared, and cultures connected. In truth, the Viking world was not an isolated corner of the north but a vibrant crossroads that stretched from the icy Atlantic to the sands of Arabia. Even the smallest village, tucked away in a fjord or hidden among forests, was part of a web of contact that reached across continents. To step into a Viking village was to step into a community that was simultaneously local and global, rooted in the soil of Scandinavia yet tied by trade and travel to the farthest edges of the known world. Waterways were the lifeblood of this connection. The same rivers and seas that carried raiders to foreign lands also carried merchants and explorers. Viking longships, famed for their speed and versatility, were not only engines of war but also tools of commerce. Their shallow keels allowed them to sail up rivers deep into the heart of Europe, while their sturdy hulls braved the open seas of the Atlantic. From these vessels, trade routes fanned out in every direction. Westward, they reached the British Isles, Ireland, and eventually Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland on the coast of North America. Eastward, they traveled the great rivers of Russia, linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and beyond to Constantinople and the Caliphates. Southward, they connected with Frankish markets, Mediterranean ports, and the deserts of the Middle East. What began as small voyages of necessity became one of the most remarkable networks of contact in medieval history. The goods exchanged in this network were as varied as the lands they came from. From the villages of Scandinavia flowed furs, prized across Europe for their warmth and rarity. Fox, beaver, and ermine pelts traveled south, symbols of wealth for kings and nobles in distant courts. Amber, gathered along the Baltic shores, was carved into beads and amulets, traded as far as Byzantium and Baghdad. Walrus ivory, carved from the tusks of animals hunted in the frozen north, became a luxury material for chess pieces, religious objects, and decorative art. Timber, iron, and fish, though less glamorous, were staples of Viking trade, the resources of a rugged land transformed into wealth abroad. In return, the Vikings brought home treasures that seemed almost magical to the eyes of villagers. Silver flowed in from the Islamic caliphates, stamped with Arabic script and often cut into pieces to be weighed and exchanged in daily trade. From Byzantium came silks that shimmered in firelight, their colors unlike anything produced in the north. Glass beads, delicate and brightly colored, adorned the clothing of women and children, their origin stretching to workshops in the Mediterranean or even the Middle East. Spices, wine, and fine pottery trickled into villages, tokens of a wider world that few villagers would ever see but whose presence reminded them that they were part of something vast. Even the simplest settlement, far from the centers of power, might hold a shard of Roman glass or a coin from Baghdad, proof of journeys that spanned thousands of miles. But trade was more than the movement of objects, it was the movement of ideas, stories, and people. Viking merchants learned foreign languages, adopted new customs, and returned with tales of cities whose size and splendor dwarfed anything in Scandinavia. In Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, Norsemen served as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard, bringing back both riches and first-hand experience of the Eastern world. In markets along the Volga, they met Muslim traders who offered not only goods but glimpses of faith and culture utterly different from their own. These encounters expanded horizons, subtly shaping the culture of villages that might seem remote but were never truly cut off. Not all trade was peaceful. Alongside legitimate commerce came the grim traffic of slaves. Thralls captured in raids were sold across Europe and the Middle East, their labor and bodies turned into commodities. Villages that seemed ordinary might hold men and women torn from foreign lands, their presence a silent testament to the darker side of Viking commerce. Slavery was not a peripheral activity but a central pillar of the Viking economy, feeding demand in markets from Dublin to Baghdad. This human trade left scars on countless lives, even as it enriched the households and communities that profited from it. The act of travel itself was transformative. Voyages demanded skill, courage, and navigation techniques that remain astonishing. Vikings steered by the stars, by the flight of birds, and by the color of the sea. Their knowledge of winds and currents passed down through generations. To cross the North Atlantic in open ships was a feat of endurance and expertise, proof of a maritime culture unparalleled in its age. Every journey carried risk. Storms could smash ships to splinters, foreign rulers could betray promises, and disease could strike far from home. Yet still they sailed, driven by hunger for wealth, curiosity, and the restless spirit that defined their age. Back in the village, the fruits of travel transformed daily life. A silver brooch or a silk ribbon might elevate a family's status, while access to foreign goods could cement alliances and marriages. Even the stories brought back by returning travelers shaped the imagination of communities, weaving new images of the world into the fabric of sagas and songs. Children grew up hearing of distant lands where cities gleamed with marble, deserts stretched without end, and markets overflowed with wonders. These tales blurred the line between myth and reality, but they also inspired the next generation to look beyond the horizon. Trade and travel, then, were not separate from Viking life but integral to it. They provided the wealth that sustained households, the prestige that elevated leaders, and the connections that tied small communities to the sweep of history. Without them, the Viking Age would have been confined to the north, a footnote in European history. Instead, it became an era where villages at the edge of the known world reached across continents, their influence felt in markets, courts, and cities far beyond their size. To walk through a Viking village was to see this global connection hidden in plain sight. A woman wore beads from the Middle East. A man paid debts with a coin minted in faraway lands. A child played with a carved walrus ivory toy, the tusk harvested in the Arctic. Every object carried a story of travel, risk, and exchange. And so, while raiding forged fearsome reputations, it was trade and travel that truly wove Viking communities into the tapestry of the medieval world, ensuring their place not only as destroyers but as connectors, bridging cultures across oceans and centuries. If the daily life of a Viking village was filled with toil, smoke, and hardship, then festivals and feasts were the bright flames that broke through the darkness. In a world where survival often meant monotonous meals of porridge and endless labor in the fields, moments of celebration stood out with dazzling intensity. These gatherings were not only about food and drink but about identity, faith, and the fragile joy of being alive in a harsh land. To sit in the longhouse during a feast was to experience the Viking spirit at its most vivid, a blend of laughter, ritual, and danger where bonds were forged and sometimes broken. The calendar of Viking life was punctuated by festivals tied to the seasons and the gods. Yule, celebrated in the depths of winter, was the most important of all. In the longest nights of the year, when the sun seemed to vanish and hope was tested, families gathered around the hearth with food, ale, and stories. Fires blazed to call back the sun, animals were sacrificed to honor the gods, and toasts were raised to ancestors who watched from beyond. Yule was both solemn and joyful, a promise that light would return, and that community could endure even in the coldest of times. Spring brought another round of festivals, marking the fertility of the land and livestock, with offerings to Freyr and Freyja to ensure abundance. Harvest time, too, was a moment of thanksgiving, when communities gathered to celebrate survival and give thanks for the grain and livestock that would carry them through the next winter. These festivals were not quiet affairs. They were marked by long tables piled with roasted meat, steaming stews, and fresh bread. Mead and ale flowed freely, drunk from horns passed around the hall. The air rang with laughter, music, and the chanting of toasts. A feast was both luxury and necessity, for it was a way to strengthen social ties, to remind each member of the village that survival was not a solitary struggle but a shared endeavor. The chieftain or host bore the responsibility of generosity, ensuring that no guest left hungry or unacknowledged. To provide abundantly was to show strength and leadership, to fail was to invite shame. Entertainment filled these gatherings with energy. Skalds recited sagas and poems, weaving tales of gods, heroes, and ancient battles. Their words carried not only entertainment but history, preserving memory through performance. Musicians played simple instruments, harps, flutes, and drums, accompanying songs that shifted from solemn chants to rowdy drinking tunes. Board games like Nefadafel were played, a strategy game of kings and warriors that foreshadowed the chess of later Europe. Children mimicked their elders, rolling dice carved from bone or chasing one another through the hall. In these moments, the longhouse transformed from a place of survival into a theater of joy, where every voice contributed to the symphony of the feast. Yet the energy of celebration was not without danger. The more the mead flowed, the thinner the line between laughter and violence became. Feasts could descend into brawls, with insults over honor or slights over toasts sparking sudden fights. To drink together was to risk one's tongue loosening too far, and many sagas recall how celebrations ended in blood, with friendships shattered in a single moment of drunken rage. These feasts reflected the duality of Viking life, communal joy always shadowed by potential conflict, abundance always edged by scarcity. Rituals were woven into these moments of celebration. Toasts, known as bragerfull, were not casual drinks but solemn acts of devotion. The first toast was offered to Odin, for victory and wisdom. The second honored Njord and Freyr, for prosperity and fertility. The third was dedicated to ancestors, inviting their presence into the hall. Only after these solemn moments did the drinking turn festive, with toasts exchanged among friends, each binding words of loyalty, oaths, or boasts to the shared cup. To break such a toast was to break honor itself, a serious offense in a culture that valued promises above all. Feasts also marked life's most significant transitions. Weddings were grand occasions, binding families together with elaborate meals, songs, and rituals that stretched for days. Funerals, too, were moments of both mourning and feasting, where the dead were honored with food and drink, their lives celebrated as much as grieved. In these ceremonies, eating and drinking became sacred acts, bridging the gap between the living and the dead, between human and divine. The feast was never just about filling the stomach, it was about filling the soul with connection, memory, and meaning. Even in times of scarcity, entertainment and ritual persisted. A modest feast might include little more than fish, bread, and ale, but the act of gathering itself was powerful. Songs still rang out, stories were still told, and laughter still echoed against the wooden beams of the longhouse. The ability to find joy in such moments, no matter how meager the food, was itself an act of defiance against the brutal conditions of life. It reminded villagers that even in hunger and hardship, they remained part of something larger than themselves. The feasts and festivals of the Viking Age reveal the heart of their culture. They were times of release, where the weight of survival could be lifted, if only briefly, by song, drink, and community. They reinforced hierarchies, strengthened friendships, and provided a stage for both honor and shame. They were both sacred and profane, weaving devotion to gods with the simple pleasures of laughter and warmth. To sit at a Viking feast was to taste the full spectrum of their existence, harshness and joy, faith and folly, unity and conflict. In the flickering firelight of these gatherings, the Vikings revealed themselves not only as warriors and farmers but as storytellers, dreamers, and revelers. Their laughter carried through the smoky halls, mingling with the scent of roasted meat and the sweet tang of mead. For a night, hunger was forgotten, toil was set aside, and life itself was celebrated in all its raw and fleeting beauty. The story of the Viking village is not one of horned helmets, endless raids, and fire-scorched monasteries, but of smoky longhouses, muddy fields, and the relentless rhythm of daily survival. To strip away the myth is not to diminish the Vikings but to see them more clearly, as people whose lives were both ordinary and extraordinary, harsh yet filled with moments of joy, bound to their homes even as they carved paths across oceans. The image of the Viking as a savage raider is only half the truth. The other half lies in the quiet labor of women tending fields, children learning by firelight, craftsmen shaping tools, and families gathering for rituals that gave meaning to their struggles. It is easy to remember the Vikings for their violence, for the terror their ships inspired when sails appeared suddenly on foreign shores. But raiding was only the visible edge of a much deeper society. Those warriors came from villages that had nurtured them from birth, shaping their bodies with hard work and their minds with stories of gods and ancestors. Every raid that spread fear abroad was anchored in a community that kept the fires burning, the animals fed, and the fields planted. Without the village, there would be no longships, no warriors, no sagas, only scattered men with swords, unable to endure. The power of the Vikings was born not just in bloodshed but in the endurance of their everyday lives. These lives were neither glamorous nor easy. Families slept crowded together in the smoke and heat of the longhouse, their privacy surrendered to the needs of survival. Winters pressed in with cold and hunger, forcing people to rely on stores that sometimes ran out before spring. Disease and death walked hand in hand with every season, taking children, mothers, and fathers long before their time. Yet even in this constant struggle, there was resilience and dignity. The Vikings did not merely endure, they created a culture that bound them together with law, honor, and faith, a culture strong enough to carry them to the farthest reaches of the known world. The myths have often overshadowed the realities, but the realities are no less compelling. The shield maiden of legend may have been rare, yet Viking women wielded power in other ways, managing households, owning land, and preserving traditions. Children may not have been warriors, but they carried the weight of survival from the moment they could walk, their games training them for the roles they would assume too soon. Festivals may have ended in brawls, yet they also bound communities with laughter, music, and ritual, offering brief reprieve from toil. Even the darkest practices, sacrifices, outlawry, brutal justice, were part of a system that sought balance in a world where order was fragile and chaos was never far away. To walk through the ruins of a Viking settlement today is to see little more than stone outlines and fragments of daily life, a cooking pot, a comb carved from bone, a worn shoe, a child's toy. Yet each of these artifacts whispers of lives lived fully, if not comfortably. They tell us of people who valued craft, who cared for their children, who gathered to tell stories and sing songs, who fought not only enemies abroad but also hunger, cold, and the uncertainty of nature. These fragments remind us that the Vikings were not caricatures of savagery but human beings, bound by the same desires, fears, and hopes that shape us still. Their legacy endures not because they were superhuman raiders but because they were deeply human survivors. They carved out a place for themselves in one of the harshest environments of the medieval world, and in doing so, they built ships that transformed history, established trade routes that stretched across continents, and left behind stories that still capture imagination 1,000 years later. The heart of that legacy was the village, the longhouse fires, the fields of barley, the forges and looms, the rituals and laughter that sustained them. It was from this foundation that they reached outward, leaving marks on lands far beyond their own. And so, when we peel back the layers of myth and legend, we see not just warriors but communities. We see the mothers who risked their lives in childbirth, the children who grew too quickly, the craftsmen whose skill shaped destiny, and the farmers whose toil kept hunger at bay. We see faith in gods both generous and cruel, rituals that bound the living to the dead, and a law that demanded both fairness and fear. We see ordinary people living in extraordinary times, their lives as real as ours, their struggles echoing across the centuries. The real Vikings behind the myth were not defined solely by what they destroyed but by what they built, endured, and believed. Their villages were fragile islands of life carved into an unforgiving landscape, yet from these humble places emerged a people whose influence stretched across the seas and into legend. To remember them only as raiders is to forget half their story. To remember them as they truly were, farmers, mothers, children, craftsmen, storytellers, and survivors, is to see the Viking Age not as a tale of endless war, but as a testament to human resilience, creativity, and the timeless will to endure. The 1920s are often remembered as an age of glitter, of champagne towers and smoke-filled jazz clubs, but beneath the shimmering surface lay a hidden war fought in the shadows of the American night. Prohibition, intended as a moral crusade to cleanse society of alcohol's corruption, instead birthed an underground empire of speakeasies, bootleggers, and criminal networks whose legacy still haunts the imagination. Rare photographs from the decade capture this paradox in striking detail: glamorous women in sequin dresses sipping cocktails in secret bars while, just outside, federal agents pose with smashed barrels of liquor, their axes raised like executioners. The lens reveals a world divided between those who reveled in defiance and those tasked with enforcing a law that millions had no intention of obeying. Speakeasies themselves were both myth and reality. In photos, their doors are often marked only by a faint symbol or a half-hidden staircase leading down into basements or up into dimly lit rooms above barbershops. Patrons are captured mid-laugh, raising glasses that the law declared illegal, their eyes gleaming with both joy and risk. These images pull us into a world where danger mingled with delight, where a night of dancing could be interrupted by the sound of pounding fists on the door. Yet, other photographs reveal the less romantic side: cramped rooms reeking of smoke, crude moonshine poured into mismatched glasses, and workers toiling to keep the illusion alive. For every glittering Charleston dance captured on film, there was another image of exhausted bartenders wiping sweat from their brows, or musicians playing on instruments scarred by constant use, sustaining a culture of rebellion. Bootleggers became folk heroes in some communities, their portraits appearing almost proudly in local papers before police dragged them away. Rare images show trucks with hidden compartments stuffed with bottles, ingenious disguises like priests' robes or milk containers used to smuggle liquor past checkpoints. In one haunting photograph, a child no older than 10 is seen carrying a small barrel into a back alley, a reminder that the trade ensnared not only hardened gangsters but entire families desperate for income. While the legends of bootleggers often emphasize their daring escapades, the photographs tell a harsher truth: many of these men and women lived under constant threat, facing not only the law but rival gangs ready to eliminate competition without mercy. The rise of organized crime is inseparable from these images. Al Capone's empire in Chicago, though romanticized by later films, is documented in chilling photographs of crime scenes: bodies slumped in cars, gangsters sprawled on sidewalks, their tailored suits soaked in blood. The infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, often remembered as a story, survives in stark police photos that leave nothing to the imagination. Yet alongside these grisly scenes are photos of Capone himself, smiling at charity events, handing out food to the poor, a public image carefully crafted to mask the violence that funded his generosity. The contrast between these images reveals the dark genius of organized crime in the 1920s. It thrived not only on fear but on charm, weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life while operating from the shadows. Law enforcement, too, is frozen in photographs that betray their own contradictions. Federal agents are pictured proudly standing over piles of smashed liquor bottles, their hats tipped back, their faces serious with purpose. Yet other photos show them drinking the very contraband they had confiscated, or accepting bribes slipped across tables. Corruption was not hidden from the camera, it was an open secret etched into the weary expressions of officers who knew they were fighting a losing battle. Some images even capture police laughing with bar owners after staged raids, the so-called busts serving more as theater than justice. The rare photos strip away the myth of absolute authority and instead reveal a chaotic dance between enforcers and the defiant public. Women, too, occupied a central role in these hidden worlds. Photographs of flappers, their short dresses swaying as they danced the Charleston, are iconic, but behind the glamour lay a more radical act. Every sip of liquor, every puff of smoke, was an open rebellion against social norms that had long confined them. Rare photographs show women bartenders, cigarette dangling from their lips as they poured drinks with a confidence once reserved for men. Others show groups of women at police stations, arrested in raids yet laughing defiantly at the cameras, their mugshots turned into symbols of resistance. These images remind us that Prohibition did not only reshape nightlife, it reshaped gender roles, pushing women into spaces of public rebellion previously denied to them. Moonshine operations, often hidden in rural backwoods, add another layer to this visual narrative. Photos of makeshift stills deep in forests show men working by lantern light, surrounded by coils of copper tubing and barrels bubbling with illegal brew. Some images capture raids where authorities pour toxic concoctions into streams, the liquid foaming like a chemical wound upon the earth. These scenes are far from the glamour of city speakeasies, they are gritty, dangerous, and often deadly. Poisonings from poorly made liquor-filled hospitals, and rare photographs of ward rooms lined with victims tell a sobering story. The hidden cost of cheap alcohol was human lives sacrificed on the altar of desperation and demand. The entertainment world embraced this defiance, and photographers immortalized it. Jazz bands played furiously in dimly lit clubs, their faces caught in sweat-drenched close-ups, horns gleaming in the half-light. Dancers kicked up their heels with abandon, their blurred movements in long-exposure photos conveying the sense of speed and liberation that defined the age. Yet the camera also captured quieter moments, a lone saxophonist in a corner, a couple whispering secrets at a table, an exhausted dancer catching her breath between songs. These images remind us that behind the energy was exhaustion, behind the music was the grind of survival in a decade that asked its performers to play harder, faster, louder, anything to drown out the silence left by the war and the suffocating grip of Prohibition. Perhaps the most striking photographs of all are those of the raids. Federal agents bursting through doors, flashbulbs catching shocked patrons mid-drink, women covering their faces as men raise their hands in surrender. In some images, laughter breaks through, as if the absurdity of being arrested for sharing a glass of wine was too much to bear. Other photos show humiliation, lines of people being marched through streets, their faces marked with shame as neighbors watched. These moments, frozen forever, reveal how Prohibition criminalized ordinary pleasures and turned millions into lawbreakers, eroding respect for authority with every shattered bottle. Looking at these rare photographs today, one cannot help but see Prohibition as both farce and tragedy. The glamour, the rebellion, the music, and the danger were all real, but so were the corpses in alleyways, the children poisoned by bad liquor, the corruption that seeped into every level of society. The hidden side of the 1920s was a world where the law itself became a stage for defiance, where cameras captured both the sparkle of champagne glasses and the shadows of violence lurking behind them. The photographs remind us that the era was never simply roaring, it was a constant duel between light and darkness, celebration and crime, glamour and grit, each frame a fragment of a story too complex to be reduced to myth. The photographs of Harlem in the 1920s reveal a world vibrating with energy, creativity, and resilience. At first glance, the images seem ordinary, a crowded street with vendors calling out their goods, a jazz band setting up instruments in the corner of a club, children chasing one another down a narrow alley. But when we look closer, when we allow these rare photos to whisper their truths, we see the heartbeat of the Harlem Renaissance, an extraordinary cultural awakening born out of struggle, defiance, and an unyielding belief in the power of art to transform existence. Every captured smile, every tired face, every blurred movement of a dancer's feet tells a story about Black America in a decade that promised freedom but still withheld it in countless ways. In one rare photograph, a group of writers huddle together in a smoky apartment, papers scattered across a small table. The lighting is poor, the furniture sparse, but the faces glow with determination. Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, these names now carry weight, but in these photos they are simply young dreamers daring to reimagine the narrative of their people. They wrote poetry that confronted injustice, novels that celebrated identity, and plays that demanded recognition. Their portraits, captured in candid moments, remind us that the Renaissance was not a glamorous phenomenon but an everyday grind of words scribbled late at night, manuscripts rejected, and voices fighting to be heard in a world that tried to silence them. Music, of course, is inseparable from the imagery of Harlem. Jazz clubs like the Cotton Club or the Savoy Ballroom come alive in rare photographs showing packed dance floors, couples twirling with abandon, and musicians lost in the ecstasy of rhythm. Duke Ellington at the piano, his fingers blurred across the keys, Bessie Smith standing before a microphone, her eyes closed as if channeling every sorrow and every joy into her song. Yet for all the glamour captured in these photos, another reality lurks in the shadows. Many of these clubs were segregated, black performers entertaining white audiences, while black patrons were often excluded from the very spaces their culture had made famous. A photograph of a group of black patrons waiting outside while a line of white socialites files in speaks volumes about the contradictions of the era. The Renaissance was a moment of cultural brilliance, but it unfolded in a nation still divided by the color line. Everyday life in Harlem was just as crucial to this hidden story. Rare images show overcrowded apartments, entire families living in a single room with thin walls and cracked plaster. Children are pictured sleeping three to a bed, mothers ironing clothes late into the night, fathers returning home exhausted from menial jobs that barely paid enough to survive. And yet, even in these photos of hardship, there is dignity. A woman adjusts her hat in a broken mirror, a boy proudly holds a book he borrowed from the library, neighbors gather on stoops to share laughter that defies despair. These candid moments remind us that the Renaissance was not confined to galleries and nightclubs, it was lived in kitchens, streets, and tenement stairwells, in the daily struggle to turn survival into art. The photographers who documented Harlem often did so with a sense of mission. James van der Zee, perhaps the most famous, left behind a vast collection of portraits that capture both the elegance and the pride of black families. His studio photographs show women in elaborate gowns, men in sharp suits, children dressed in their Sunday best. These images, carefully staged and beautifully lit, were statements of identity. Here we are, dignified and worthy, refusing to be diminished by stereotypes. But beyond the studio walls, Van der Zee's candid shots reveal another layer: street scenes filled with joy and chaos, funerals that brought entire blocks to a standstill, parades that proclaimed unity and resilience. His lens did not shy away from reality, it embraced it in all its complexity. Not all photographs, however, convey triumph. Some capture the simmering tensions beneath the surface. Police raids on speakeasies in Harlem targeted black-owned businesses disproportionately, and photographs of these raids show patrons being dragged into the street, faces marked with humiliation. Other images show protests, with placards demanding equal rights, better housing, and fair wages. These rare photos are reminders that the Harlem Renaissance was not just an artistic movement, it was also political, a fight for visibility in a nation that preferred to look away. The art and the struggle were intertwined, each feeding the other, each necessary for survival. The fashions of Harlem were themselves a form of art, immortalized in photographs that glow with personality. Women wore bold dresses, feathers in their hair, long pearl necklaces that swung as they danced. Men posed in tailored suits, hats tilted at confident angles, shoes polished to a shine. These were not simply clothes, they were declarations of presence, armor against a world that sought to reduce them. In group photos of dances and community gatherings, you can see how style became a collective language, a shared performance of identity and pride. Yet, if you look closely, you also notice the wear on the fabrics, the small tears in the seams, reminders that beneath the sparkle was the unrelenting weight of economic struggle. Religion and spirituality, too, were etched into the photographic record of Harlem. Churches overflowed, there. Pews packed with congregants who found in faith both solace and strength. Rare photos show gospel choirs mid-song, faces lifted toward the heavens, robes flowing in unison. Street preachers, captured on corners with outstretched arms, drew crowds who listened with rapt attention. These images reveal another side of the Renaissance. While art and literature flourished, so too did a spiritual resilience that anchored the community. In the midst of poverty, crime, and prejudice, faith provided continuity, hope, and a sense of belonging. Children are perhaps the most poignant figures in these photographs. In some images, they appear joyful, playing stickball in alleys, skipping rope on sidewalks, their laughter echoing across decades. In others, they look weary, faces prematurely aged by responsibility, carrying groceries, caring for younger siblings, working small jobs to help their families survive. These photographs remind us that the Renaissance was not just about adults creating art and music, it was also about raising a generation in conditions both inspiring and harsh. Every child captured in these photos carried within them the future of a movement that was still fighting for recognition. The contradictions of Haarlem in the 1920s are perhaps best seen in the juxtaposition of photographs that sit side by side in archives. A glamorous portrait of Josephine Baker in a dazzling costume might appear alongside an image of men standing in unemployment lines. A photo of a crowded dance floor at the Savoy might be paired with another showing tenement hallways lined with buckets catching water from leaking roofs. This is the hidden truth. The Haarlem Renaissance was both a triumph of spirit and a daily battle against crushing realities. The photos, rare and often overlooked, refuse to let us forget either side of the story. When we study these images today, we are struck by their vitality, their ability to capture fleeting moments that pulse with life. But they also serve as warnings and lessons. They remind us that cultural brilliance often emerges not from comfort but from struggle, not from wealth but from the refusal to be silenced. The hidden side of the 1920s lives in these photographs, in the eyes of writers dreaming in smoky apartments, in the sweat of musicians playing until dawn, in the laughter of children chasing one another down crowded streets, in the quiet dignity of families posing proudly in their best clothes. Haarlem in the 1920s was more than a neighborhood, it was a stage where the hidden stories of Black America were written, sung, painted, and photographed for the world to see, even if the world was not ready to understand. The glittering myth of the Roaring Twenties often blinds us to its shadows. Rare photographs that surface from archives tell a story that history books often push aside. Poverty was as much a part of the 1920s as jazz, cocktails, and flapper dresses. For every dazzling photo of a Manhattan skyline rising into modernity, there exists another of breadlines stretching down blocks, of families wrapped in patched coats standing in the biting wind, of children with bare feet walking streets littered with coal dust. The contradiction was stark, prosperity for some, struggle for many, and the camera captured it without mercy. These images reveal the hidden side of a decade we think we know, a side where hunger, homelessness, and silent despair stood in harsh contrast to roaring parties. In urban centers, tenement life was a reality for millions. Photographs from New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia show families packed into single-room apartments where light barely entered and ventilation was non-existent. A rare photo of a mother cooking on a small stove wedged into the corner of a room tells volumes, clothes hanging overhead to dry, children sitting cross-legged on the floor, the wallpaper peeling in long strips. Outside, alleyways were lined with trash, and open sewers ran between buildings. These were the neighborhoods that rarely made it into the glowing advertisements of prosperity, but the photos remain, silent witnesses of hardship amid supposed national wealth. When juxtaposed with images of the same city's glimmering nightlife, the truth becomes undeniable: the 1920s were never a golden age for all. Child labor, though slowly being restricted by reform movements, was still captured in haunting photographs during the decade. Small boys in oversized caps crouched beside machines in textile mills, their faces smudged with grease and dust. Girls with braids and tired eyes sorted vegetables in canneries or sold newspapers on street corners. One rare photograph shows a boy no older than 8 carrying a heavy sack of coal, his body bent under its weight, his expression frozen in grim determination. These children were part of the hidden workforce that kept industries moving, even as wealthy socialites toasted champagne to prosperity. For many families, every pair of hands, no matter how small, was essential to survival. Rural poverty tells another side of the story, one less visible in the roaring cities but just as devastating. Farmers, particularly in the South and Midwest, faced falling crop prices and crushing debt throughout the decade. Rare photographs show farmers standing beside fields of cotton they could not afford to harvest, barns collapsing under disrepair, and families gathered around tables set with little more than cornbread and milk. Drought and soil exhaustion devastated large areas, and the photos reflect the weariness etched into the faces of those who worked the land. These were not the faces of roaring prosperity, they were the faces of endurance, of people left behind in a decade supposedly defined by abundance. The starkest contrast can be seen in photographs of breadlines during economic downturns within the decade, particularly in industrial cities hit by temporary recessions. Men in tattered coats line up for bowls of soup served by charities, their hats pulled low to hide their faces from the camera. Rarely do we see these images in popular narratives of the 1920s, yet they existed side by side with photographs of jazz clubs, department store openings, and automobile showrooms. For every new Ford rolling off the assembly line, there were workers laid off in the same city, families who could not afford shoes, children who learned to mask hunger with silence. Photographers of the time often captured poverty with unflinching realism. Some worked for reform groups, documenting living conditions to push for legislation, while others simply captured what they saw in their neighborhoods. Their photos remind us that prosperity in the 1920s was not universal, it was selective, uneven, and often cruelly indifferent. One particularly haunting image shows a young girl asleep on a fire escape, her head resting on folded arms, her small shoes dangling over the iron bars. It was not uncommon for children to sleep outside to escape the suffocating heat of crowded apartments, and the photo becomes a chilling reminder of the fragility of life in the shadows of modern cities. Immigrant families bore a disproportionate share of this poverty. Photographs of Italian, Irish, Jewish, and Eastern European neighborhoods show men waiting on street corners for day labor, women washing clothes in shared basins, and children selling fruit from pushcarts. These communities, often derided by mainstream society, were the backbone of urban labor, and yet their photographs reveal the hardship that underpinned their contribution. In these faces we see both exhaustion and determination, the refusal to surrender despite being marginalized in the supposed land of opportunity. Poverty in the 1920s was not only economic, it was social, reinforced by prejudice and systemic exclusion. African American communities migrating north during the Great Migration faced similar struggles, their experiences captured in photographs of overcrowded housing, poorly maintained schools, and long lines at underfunded clinics. These photos remind us that the Harlem Renaissance, while culturally transformative, unfolded against a backdrop of deep poverty. The glamour of jazz and literature coexisted with the daily grind of families fighting to keep roofs over their heads. Photographs of black mothers working as laundresses, of fathers laboring in menial jobs, of children studying under dim light bulbs in cramped rooms, all tell us that brilliance emerged from environments the world rarely saw or wanted to see. The irony of these images is sharpened by the simultaneous rise of advertising and consumer culture. Magazines of the 1920s are filled with photographs of sleek cars, fashionable dresses, and luxury goods promising happiness. Yet, placed beside the rare images of families scraping together meals, the contrast is devastating. These ads sold a dream accessible only to the few, while the photographs of poverty reveal the silent majority living lives far removed from the glossy pages. It is in this juxtaposition that the hidden truth of the decade emerges most clearly: prosperity was a mirage that shimmered brightly but left millions untouched. The hidden photographs of poverty in the 1920s are not merely records of suffering, they are acts of resistance, forcing us to acknowledge what mainstream narratives prefer to forget. They capture the resilience of those who endured: the woman standing tall in a doorway despite her worn clothes, the boy smiling faintly despite the coal dust on his face, the family gathered around a modest meal, still holding together against all odds. These images remind us that beneath the surface of a roaring decade was a quiet endurance, a struggle fought daily in kitchens, fields, and factories. Without them, our picture of the 1920s would be incomplete, distorted by glamour that hid the grinding truth. With them, we see the full story, a decade of contrasts, where shadows stretched as far as the lights of progress. The story of women in the 1920s is often told through the glitter of flapper dresses, the rhythm of jazz clubs, and the triumphant image of suffragists marching with banners held high. Rare photographs do capture these iconic moments, but when studied closely, they reveal a deeper, more complex reality, one in which women lived between newfound freedoms and stubborn restrictions. The decade was a turning point, a bridge between centuries of confinement and the slow, uneven march toward equality. Every candid photograph, every studio portrait, every grainy image of women at work or at play tells us that the hidden side of the 1920s was a struggle to define identity in a world both opening and resisting. The flapper has become the symbol of the age, immortalized in photos of young women with bobbed hair, short skirts, and daring expressions as they smoked cigarettes and raised cocktails. These images shocked older generations, who saw them as evidence of moral decay. But rare photographs show that the flapper's rebellion was more than fashion, it was defiance. One famous image captures a group of women at a beach, their swimsuits rising above the knee, smiling as policemen measure hemlines to enforce decency laws. The laughter on their faces is both playful and radical, a rejection of the idea that society could dictate their bodies. Yet such images also reveal the backlash, the constant scrutiny, and the reality that women's freedom was policed in every sense of the word. Alongside this cultural shift, political progress had taken a long-awaited step forward. The 19th Amendment, granting American women the right to vote, had been ratified in 1920. Rare photographs of women lined up at polling stations for the first time capture the gravity of the moment, mothers holding children while marking ballots, elderly women in black dresses clutching purses as they entered voting booths, young suffragists proudly wearing sashes even after their long campaign had ended. These images remind us that democracy had finally opened its doors, but only partially. Many women of color, particularly in the South, still faced barriers through intimidation, discriminatory laws, and violence. Photographs of black women registering to vote in northern cities contrast sharply with images from the South where their rights were suppressed. The camera lens does not lie, it captures both victory and exclusion in the same decade. Women in the workforce were also redefining roles, and rare photos document their presence in offices, factories, and schools. Secretaries pose beside typewriters, nurses stand proudly in hospital wards, and teachers conduct classrooms filled with eager students. Yet other photographs tell the hidden side of the story: long lines of women working in textile mills for meager wages, female garment workers on strike, mothers balancing infants on their hips while operating machinery. These images remind us that economic freedom was limited, often confined to low-paying, labor-intensive jobs. One particularly telling photo shows a line of women at a telephone exchange, each hunched over a switchboard, their expressions weary. While celebrated as modern workers, they endured long hours and strict rules, earning little compared to their male counterparts. At home, women's lives reflected both change and continuity. Rare photographs of family gatherings show women as the anchors of domestic life, preparing meals, mending clothes, and raising children. The 1920s introduced new household technologies, electric irons, washing machines, refrigerators, that promised to reduce drudgery. Advertisements of the time celebrated these innovations, often showing smiling women in spotless kitchens. But candid photographs reveal that many households could not afford such luxuries, and women continued to labor over coal stoves and hand-wash laundry in crowded basins. The hidden truth is that the so-called revolution in domestic life was uneven, benefiting only those who could pay for it. Fashion, captured endlessly by photographers, became another battleground of identity. Short skirts, cloche hats, silk stockings, and bold makeup defined the flapper look, but not every woman embraced or could afford such trends. Rare photographs of rural women in plain dresses and aprons stand in sharp contrast to the city fashions. In these images, we see the divide between urban and rural America, where change was embraced in one and resisted in the other. For many women, especially in conservative communities, the old standards of modesty remained intact, and the photographs reflect the stark cultural divide that defined the decade. The restrictions on women were not only cultural but also deeply legal and social. Photographs of courtrooms where women fought for divorce, custody, or workplace rights capture the resistance they faced. One haunting image shows a woman sitting outside a courthouse, her face drawn with exhaustion after losing custody of her children simply because she dared to seek independence. Others show groups of women arrested during protests, their mugshots lined up in police files. These images tell us that every step toward freedom was met with resistance, that the path to equality was neither smooth nor guaranteed. Beyond America, rare photographs of women in Europe and Asia during the 1920s reveal similar struggles and triumphs. British suffragists are pictured celebrating victories even as they continue to demand full rights. In the Soviet Union, women are photographed driving tractors and teaching in schools, their images used as propaganda to show gender equality in a new society. Yet behind these staged photos were still countless restrictions and challenges. In India, images of women in protests against colonial rule remind us that the fight for freedom and gender rights often overlapped, each feeding the other. These global photographs widen our perspective, reminding us that the 1920s were not only a decade of American change but part of a larger wave of transformation, resistance, and contradiction. The private lives of women were also documented in photographs that rarely make it into history books. Snapshots of women laughing together on picnics, writing in journals, or practicing on musical instruments show the intimacy of their lives. These quiet moments, often captured by friends or family, reveal the humanity beneath the headlines. One rare image shows a woman in a modest apartment reading a novel, her expression thoughtful, her posture relaxed. It is an ordinary scene, but it tells us that beyond the noise of public change, women were also carving out personal spaces of reflection and identity. Perhaps the most striking contrast comes when we place photographs side by side, women dancing in sequin dresses under the glow of stage lights next to women standing in breadlines with children clinging to their skirts, women casting ballots proudly next to women turned away from polling stations, women working at typewriters in air-conditioned offices next to women hunched in sweatshops with no ventilation. These juxtapositions reveal the hidden truth, that the decade of liberation was also a decade of exclusion, that freedom was never equally distributed, and that photographs preserved both the progress and the unfinished battles. Looking back at these rare images today, we see not only the beauty and daring of the flapper but also the persistence of struggle. We see women pushing against boundaries in fashion, politics, work, and personal life, even as society sought to confine them. The 1920s were not simply a celebration of women's liberation, they were a battlefield of identity, a decade where every photograph tells a story of defiance, compromise, triumph, and heartbreak. In the faces of these women, whether captured in defiance or quiet reflection, we glimpse the true hidden history of the decade, not just what women became, but what they endured to get there. The photographs of organized crime in the 1920s strip away the romance that later films would weave around gangsters. They show us a world of cold ambition, blood on the pavement, and power built on fear. Yet they also reveal why men like Al Capone became legends in their own time, because they were as visible in charity lines and parades as they were in police files. The hidden side of the decade is etched into these images, where glamour and violence coexist in every frame, forcing us to see organized crime not as myth, but as a brutal reality that defined the Prohibition era. One rare photograph captures Al Capone at a baseball game, smiling broadly in a tailored suit, his arm around a child as though he were any other civic leader. The crowd beams, oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the blood that financed his fortune. Juxtapose this with police photographs of Capone's men sprawled in alleyways after shootouts, their expensive shoes protruding from beneath blood-stained coats. These are not scenes from a script, they are evidence, captured by flashbulbs, of a city caught in the grip of men who ruled not only the nightclubs but the streets themselves. The photos remind us that the mob thrived because it was both feared and admired, condemned in public yet quietly tolerated in private. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 produced some of the most infamous photographs of the decade. Police images show 7 men lined up against a wall, riddled with bullets, their bodies crumpled on the cold floor of a Chicago garage. The starkness of the photos shocked the nation, laying bare the violence that Prohibition had unleashed. These photographs circulated in newspapers, their brutality undeniable, and they stripped away any illusion of gangster glamour. Yet even then, the myth of the gangster endured, because photographs of funerals showed mobs of mourners, long lines of cars, and floral arrangements spelling out names of the fallen as though they were soldiers in a noble cause. The contrast was startling: men mourned as heroes in one photo, exposed as killers in another. Bootlegging itself appears in countless rare images, each one a glimpse into the ingenuity and danger of the trade. Cars with false floors, hidden compartments, and barrels disguised as milk churns line the archives. One particularly fascinating photo shows a church altar hollowed out to conceal bottles of whiskey, the sacred and the profane colliding in a single frame. Federal agents often posed proudly with their discoveries, raiding warehouses filled with crates, smashing open barrels while photographers captured the dramatic moment. Yet other photos tell a different story: agents laughing with bootleggers, or quietly slipping bottles into their own cars. Corruption was as photogenic as enforcement, and the camera reveals that the line between law and crime was blurred beyond recognition. The mob's presence in nightlife is frozen in photographs of speakeasies under their control. Waiters in tuxedos serve crowded tables, musicians play furiously, dancers blur across the frame in motion. These are not just images of entertainment, they are visual proof of the mob's grip on pleasure itself. Every drink poured, every band paid, every cigarette lit was underwritten by criminal enterprise. In one striking photo, a nightclub owner shakes hands with a police captain in front of the bar, a handshake that, in reality, was worth thousands in protection money. The photographs of nightlife are glittering, but they shine with the shadows of violence just beyond the frame. Funeral photographs, strangely enough, became iconic symbols of mob life. The deaths of gangsters were often public spectacles, and rare images show streets lined with mourners, floral tributes towering over coffins, and expensive cars stretching for blocks. These funerals were not simply about grief, they were performances of power, reminders to rivals and to the public that organized crime was untouchable, its reach extending even into the rituals of death. Yet there are other photos, more private, where widows and children weep quietly beside coffins, their grief raw and unperformed. These images cut through the myth, revealing that behind every gangster story was a family shattered by violence. The photographs also expose the reach of organized crime into everyday businesses. Groceries, laundries, and taxi companies appear in images where detectives stand outside shuttered doors, businesses destroyed for refusing to pay protection. One chilling photo shows a bombed-out storefront, shards of glass glittering in the street, bystanders staring in horror. Organized crime was not only about liquor and gambling, it was about extortion, a reign of fear documented in photos of burned buildings, bullet-riddled shop windows, and terrified owners testifying in court. These images reveal the cost of resistance and the invisible tax imposed on ordinary people by the empire of crime. Mugshots from the 1920s tell yet another side of the story. Rare photographs of young men barely in their 20s, slicked hair, and sharp suits, eyes hardened for the camera, remind us that gangsters were not born, they were made in the crucible of poverty, prohibition, and opportunity. Some smile defiantly in their photos, others look away, but each face is a fragment of a larger system. These mugshots, lined up in police archives, show how organized crime recruited from the margins of society, offering wealth and status to those denied it elsewhere. Yet the same photos also expose the disposability of these men, many of whom would not live to see 30. Photographs of women connected to organized crime reveal another hidden layer. Some appear as glamorous companions at nightclubs, dressed in fur and pearls, their presence reinforcing the aura of wealth and allure. Others, however, are pictured in courtrooms, accused of smuggling liquor, or in mugshots themselves, their faces defiant, refusing to bow to shame. These images remind us that women were not merely bystanders in the underworld, they were participants, sometimes victims, sometimes collaborators, always part of the tapestry of crime that defined the decade. Looking at these rare photographs now, nearly a century later, the myths of organized crime dissolve into something darker, more human, and more complex. The camera caught the smile of Capone handing out food to the poor and the cold eyes of his men standing over bodies. It captured the joy of speakeasy dancers and the terror of bombed-out storefronts. It froze funerals that doubled as parades of power, and it preserved mugshots of boys who would not see old age. The hidden side of organized crime in the 1920s was that it was not separate from society, it was woven into its very fabric. The photographs show us that the mob was not a shadow world, but an open empire, built in plain sight, immortalized in images that speak louder than myth ever could. The 1920s were an age of speed, invention, and machines that promised to transform daily life. Rare photographs from the decade capture a world caught between the horse-drawn past and the mechanized future, where modernity arrived with both wonder and danger. In these images, technology is not just a collection of objects, it is a character in its own right, reshaping how people lived, traveled, worked, and dreamed. The hidden story behind these photos is that progress was thrilling, but it was also reckless, leaving behind accidents, exhaustion, and anxiety that history often forgets. The automobile stands at the center of this transformation. Photographs of endless rows of Model Ts rolling off Henry Ford's assembly lines capture the triumph of mass production, the promise of mobility within reach of the middle class. Proud families posed beside their new cars, smiling as if holding proof of their arrival in modern America. Roads once quiet with carriages became crowded with traffic, captured in photos of jammed intersections and policemen directing the chaos with outstretched arms. Yet other photographs reveal the darker side: wrecked cars crumpled against trees, drivers sprawled lifeless beside twisted metal. Traffic fatalities skyrocketed in the 1920s, and the photographs remind us that the age of speed demanded a price in blood long before safety standards existed. Airplanes, too, entered daily imagination, their fragile frames immortalized in images of daring pilots. Rare photos show Charles Lindbergh preparing for his transatlantic flight, his Spirit of St. Louis gleaming in the morning light. Crowds gathered at airfields, captured in photographs craning their necks skyward as barnstormers performed stunts that seemed to defy gravity. These were not just spectacles, they were glimpses of the future, promises that the sky itself could be conquered. Yet other images tell a harsher truth: planes broken in fields, pilots standing beside wreckage with weary expressions, widows clutching photographs of men lost to experimental flights. The photographs remind us that aviation was not only about triumph but also about risk, trial, and tragedy that paved the way for progress. Skyscrapers rising from city skylines are another defining image of the 1920s. Photographs of construction workers balancing on steel beams hundreds of feet above the ground, their legs dangling casually into the air, have become iconic symbols of the era. These men, often immigrants, smiled for cameras while risking their lives daily, building monuments of glass and steel that redefined cities like New York and Chicago. The rare photographs of these workers tell us that modernity's beauty was built on human courage, sweat, and peril. One image shows a group of men eating lunch on a girder suspended in the sky, their bodies relaxed as if they had forgotten the abyss beneath them. The photograph embodies the paradox of progress, wonder and terror existing in the same moment. Electricity reshaped homes and cities, its arrival captured in photographs of neon signs blazing against the night. Streets once dark after sunset glowed with advertisements, theaters illuminated with dazzling lights promising escape. In one rare photo, a crowd gathers outside a cinema bathed in neon, their faces lit by electric glow as though staring at a portal into the future. Yet beyond the glamour, photographs also show tangled webs of wires strung haphazardly across neighborhoods, workers electrocuted while attempting repairs, and rural areas where darkness still reigned because electrification had not yet reached them. The hidden side of modernity is that it spread unevenly, creating divides between those who lived in light and those who remained in shadow. The radio was another machine that changed the decade, though its impact can only partly be seen in photographs. Families are pictured gathered around wooden cabinets, their faces intent, listening to voices and music carried through invisible waves. These images capture the intimacy of technology, the way a single device could shrink the world, bringing distant speeches, concerts, and news into living rooms. But other photos show workers in factories assembling radios in long lines, their labor invisible in the glamour of the finished product. The technology connected millions, but it also demanded new industries, long hours, and constant innovation behind the scenes. Factories themselves became shrines to modernity, and photographs of their interiors show endless rows of machines tended by weary workers. The scale is overwhelming, hundreds of identical cars, shoes, or radios lined up, each product a triumph of standardization. But rare photographs also show exhausted men and women collapsed on benches, their bodies bent by repetition, their expressions vacant. The hidden side of industrial progress was monotony, the human spirit bent to serve machines. One haunting photo shows a woman asleep at her sewing machine, her hands still resting on fabric. Progress promised efficiency, but it drained life in ways less glamorous photographs refused to let us forget. Science, too, flourished in the 1920s, and rare photos capture both excitement and unease. Medical laboratories show scientists in white coats experimenting with new drugs, while other images reveal bizarre contraptions, electrical devices meant to cure ailments, machines that look more like torture instruments than treatments. Patients are photographed strapped into chairs, wires attached to their bodies, their faces tense with anticipation or fear. These forgotten photos remind us that innovation was often experimental, and the boundary between science and quackery blurred in ways that history rarely acknowledges. The photographs of technology in the 1920s, when viewed together, create a mosaic of contradictions. A family beaming beside their new car, a mangled wreck on the roadside. A skyscraper glittering in the night sky, a worker clinging desperately to a steel beam. A glowing radio in a living room, a factory worker asleep at their station. Each image is a fragment of a truth often hidden by the myth of unbroken progress. The 1920s were not simply a celebration of modernity, they were a test of how much risk, exhaustion, and inequality a society would accept in exchange for speed, light, and connection. Looking back at these photographs today, nearly a century later, we see both the marvel and the menace of a world learning to live with machines. We see faces of wonder, fear, pride, and fatigue, all captured by the unblinking eye of the camera. The hidden side of modernity in the 1920s is that it came with costs too easily forgotten, written not only in gleaming towers and humming radios but also in broken bodies, uneven access, and dreams pursued recklessly. The images remind us that technology is never neutral, it reshapes, uplifts, and wounds all at once. And in the 1920s, it reshaped the very rhythm of life, leaving photographs as the only witnesses to its double-edged promise. When we picture the 1920s, the mind fills with images of glittering cities, jazz clubs, and skyscrapers climbing toward the heavens. Yet rare photographs from the countryside tell a different story, one that history often leaves in shadow. For millions of Americans, the decade was not roaring but weary, not a celebration of prosperity but a daily struggle to keep farms alive, to hold families together, and to resist a modern world that seemed to be passing them by. In these photographs, we find the forgotten side of the decade, rural America caught between tradition and change, captured in haunting black and white. In one striking photo, a farmer stands in the middle of his barren field, his hands shoved deep into empty pockets, staring at rows of withered crops. The soil beneath his boots is cracked, dry, lifeless. The prosperity of the Jazz Age did not reach these lands. Instead, farmers endured falling crop prices and mounting debts. Photographs from the time show barns leaning precariously, paint peeling, doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. Families posed stiffly in front of their homes, faces etched with the fatigue of endless work that yielded little reward. Their clothes are worn, their boots caked with mud, their expressions grim but dignified. These images remind us that while cities boomed with automobiles and neon lights, vast stretches of the country faced quiet collapse. Children, too, appear frequently in these rural photographs, their lives a stark contrast to the glamorous images of flapper youth. One photo shows a boy no older than 10 guiding a plow behind a mule, his small frame dwarfed by the weight of the task. Another captures girls in patched dresses carrying buckets of water from wells, their bare feet sinking into the dust. Schoolhouses, when photographed, often appear run down, with one room serving dozens of children of varying ages. Teachers pose sternly beside their students, their blackboard scrawled with lessons, while outside, farm work waits to reclaim the children's time. These rare images reveal that education was a luxury balanced against the immediate necessity of labor. The rural economy was battered not only by falling prices but by the arrival of modern machinery that promised efficiency yet pushed many small farmers into ruin. Photographs show gleaming new tractors and harvesters, symbols of progress, but also men watching helplessly as banks repossessed farms that could not compete with mechanization. One haunting image shows a family loading furniture onto a wagon, their farm auctioned off to pay debts. The father's shoulders sag, the mother clutches a baby, the children stare blankly at the ground. These photographs, rarely included in the celebratory story of the 1920s, remind us that progress often advanced at the expense of those left behind. Religious revivalism surged in these rural communities, and photographs of open-air tent meetings reveal crowds of men, women, and children seated on wooden benches, listening intently to fiery preachers. In one photo, a preacher with arms raised high seems to command the very heavens, while the faces of the faithful shine with rapture. These gatherings were not just spiritual but social, offering unity and hope in communities battered by hardship. They also reflected resistance to modern urban values, a determination to hold on to tradition. Other photographs capture protests against teaching evolution in schools, parents gathered with signs outside courthouses, echoing the famous Scopes trial of 1925. These images expose the cultural divide that split America in the decade, cities rushing toward modernity, while rural communities clung fiercely to the old ways. Isolation is another theme carved into these rare photos. Farmhouses sit alone on endless horizons, small figures dwarfed by the vastness of fields and sky. Roads are muddy tracks barely wide enough for wagons, bridges are little more than wooden planks spanning creeks. One evocative photo shows a woman standing alone at a mailbox at the edge of a dirt road, her dress whipped by the wind, as though waiting for news from a world that seemed far away. Radios and newspapers began to shrink distances, but in many rural homes, photographs remind us that silence and solitude remained dominant. Families depended on each other, with community gatherings captured in images of harvest festivals, barn dances, and church picnics, small, joyous moments carved out of hardship. African American farmers in the South faced even harsher realities, and rare photographs tell their stories with painful clarity. Families pose beside shacks with dirt floors, their children barefoot, their tools primitive. Sharecropping kept many trapped in cycles of poverty little different from slavery, and the photographs reveal weary faces staring into cameras with a mixture of pride and resignation. Yet other images show resilience, families gathered for church services in wooden chapels, women dressed in their finest clothes for Sunday portraits, children holding books with quiet determination. These photographs preserve dignity amid struggle, reminding us that rural black communities carved out lives of strength even when excluded from the prosperity celebrated elsewhere. Immigrant farming communities also appear in the photographic record: Polish, Italian, Scandinavian families settling in the Midwest, carving livelihoods from the soil. Group portraits taken outside clapboard houses show large families, their clothing blending old-world styles with American practicality. These images tell us that the dream of ownership drove many to endure hardship, though the photos also reveal the fragility of that dream. Crops failed, debts mounted, and many found themselves at the mercy of banks or landlords. Still, the photographs testify to perseverance, to the stubborn belief that hard work might yield stability, even when the odds were stacked against them. The contrast between rural and urban America becomes clear when we set these photographs side by side. While city dwellers posed with radios, electric appliances, and fashionable clothes, rural photographs show kerosene lamps, hand-woven quilts, and dresses mended again and again. Where city streets glowed with neon, rural roads were swallowed by darkness after sunset. The photographs refuse to let us forget that the nation's prosperity was uneven, its story divided between those who had access to modernity and those left holding on to traditions for survival. And yet, not all rural photographs are marked by despair. Many capture moments of joy and continuity, children laughing as they splash in creeks, families gathered for harvest feasts, young couples courting at barn dances. These moments, frozen forever, remind us that even in hardship, life carried on with resilience and warmth. One photograph of a group of women quilting together radiates companionship, their smiles breaking through the monotony of daily labor. Another shows boys playing baseball in a field, their bats improvised from branches, their joy unrestrained. These images remind us that rural life was not simply deprivation, it was also community, endurance, and small pleasures carved out of struggle. Looking at these rare photographs today, we see the hidden side of the 1920s, not a decade of universal prosperity, but one of deep divides. The camera reveals that rural America lived in shadows even as cities basked in light, that tradition and modernity collided daily, and that survival often meant clinging to faith, community, and hard work against relentless odds. The forgotten photographs of farmhouses, families, and fields remind us that the story of the decade is incomplete without them, that the Roaring Twenties were not roaring everywhere. In the silence of these rural images, we hear the resilience of those who endured, their lives preserved not in neon lights but in the stark, honest frames of forgotten photographs. The 1920s are often painted in gold and glitter, but the photographs that survive tell us another story, one steeped in shadows, in marches by torchlight, in hatred dressed in robes and uniforms. The hidden side of the decade was political extremism, fueled by fear and prejudice, etched forever into rare images that history cannot erase. These photographs reveal that while jazz played in crowded clubs and skyscrapers reached for the sky, millions gathered in rallies of intolerance, chanting slogans, burning crosses, and insisting on walls where others hoped for bridges. The camera caught both faces of the decade, and the darker one demands our attention. One of the most chilling sets of photographs comes from the Ku Klux Klan. At its peak in the 1920s, the Klan boasted millions of members, and the photographs capture the scale of their resurgence. In one, thousands of robed figures march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., their pointed hoods glowing white beneath the sun. Families stand on sidewalks watching in silence, some cheering, others frozen in unease. In another, hooded members gather at night around a blazing cross, the flames reaching toward the sky as children look on from the crowd. These images strip away any doubt, extremism was not confined to shadows, it paraded openly, photographed proudly, woven into the very fabric of the decade. Lynchings, too, were documented in photographs that remain among the most disturbing of the era. Some images were turned into postcards, grotesquely shared as souvenirs, the cruelty doubled by the act of remembrance. The rare surviving photographs show victims hanging from trees while crowds gather below, some smiling, some pointing, some with children perched on their shoulders as though attending a festival. These are not easy images to confront, but they reveal the brutal reality of racial violence that coexisted with the Harlem Renaissance. For every photo of jazz musicians on stage, another exists of a community terrorized by hatred. The hidden side of the 1920s was that violence against Black Americans was not a relic of the past but a continuing reality, seared into the photographic record. Immigrants also became targets of hostility, their stories preserved in photographs of protests, raids, and deportations. In one image, Italian immigrants are lined up outside a police station, their faces anxious as officers examine their papers. In another, banners declare, "America for Americans," as demonstrators march against immigration, their expressions hard, their fists raised. The shadow of the Red Scare looms in photos of suspected radicals being arrested, men and women herded into trucks under suspicion of communist sympathies. These images remind us that political extremism was not only about racial hatred, it was about fear of the foreign, the different, the new. The 1920s were a decade of closing doors as much as opening ones, and the photographs lay bare the exclusionary mindset that shaped policy and culture alike. The rise of fascist movements abroad found echoes in America, and rare photos reveal early rallies where men saluted foreign leaders and spoke of strongmen as saviors. These small but growing groups, photographed in rented halls or marching in uniform, foreshadowed storms to come. Meanwhile, socialist and labor movements produced their own striking photographs, workers filling city squares with banners demanding fair wages, police clashing with strikers, picket lines stretching across streets. The camera captures both sides, workers with determined faces holding the line, and policemen swinging batons, the violence frozen mid-swing. Extremism was not confined to the right, it surged across the spectrum, with ideology clashing violently in streets and factories, each side immortalized in rare and raw photographs. The political world itself was not immune to spectacle. Campaign rallies of the decade are preserved in photographs that show stadiums filled with flags, candidates speaking beneath vast banners proclaiming promises of prosperity and stability. Yet hidden within these images are hints of division. Women standing outside with signs demanding equal recognition in politics, black activists holding placards for anti-lynching. Laws ignored by mainstream parties, immigrants demanding fair treatment while politicians posed for cameras with slogans about purity and order. The photographs tell us that even when politics appeared polished and patriotic, beneath the surface ran currents of exclusion and resentment. Religious extremism also left its imprint, and rare photographs of revivalist rallies show massive crowds gathered in open fields, preachers standing on platforms with arms raised skyward. Some photos capture the rapture in the faces of the faithful, but others reveal how these movements intertwined with politics, calling for bans on teaching evolution, for strict moral codes, for laws to enshrine their vision of society. The Scopes trial of 1925 was photographed extensively, images of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan locked in debate, crowds pressing against courthouse walls, reporters fanning themselves in the Tennessee heat. The photographs immortalize a cultural battle between science and faith, modernity and tradition, a battle that defined the decade as much as any jazz song or skyscraper. Not all resistance to extremism was crushed, and photographs also preserve moments of defiance. Civil rights leaders are pictured addressing crowds, their faces resolute, their presence a challenge to the tide of hate. Immigrant communities photograph themselves in festivals and parades, celebrating culture despite hostility. Workers posed proudly with union banners, even after strikes had been broken. These images stand as quiet counterpoints to the photographs of violence and hate, reminding us that resistance was constant, that hope flickered even in darkness. The juxtaposition of these photographs, of Klan parades and Harlem jazz, of lynching postcards and suffrage marches, of immigrant raids and immigrant festivals, tells the real story of the 1920s. It was a decade not only of progress but of polarization, not only of freedom but of fear. The photographs remind us that the optimism of the age coexisted with its deepest anxieties, and that extremism thrived not at the margins but at the center of society. They force us to confront the myth of universal joy, replacing it with a more complex truth. The 1920s were haunted by hatred, and that hatred was proudly photographed, preserved, and paraded for all to see. Looking back now, nearly a century later, these rare images are warnings as much as records. They show us how fragile progress can be, how quickly fear can turn to violence, how hatred can cloak itself in spectacle and ritual. The hidden side of the 1920s was not simply intolerance but the way intolerance was normalized, made visible, and even celebrated. In the faces frozen by the camera, whether grim with hate or resolute with defiance, we see the battles that defined a decade, battles whose echoes still reach us today. Not all photographs of the 1920s dwell in extremes of wealth or poverty, glamour or violence. Some of the most revealing images are the simplest ones, snapshots of everyday life captured without pretense, offering a glimpse into the ordinary moments that history books rarely preserve. These photographs remind us that behind the jazz clubs, the breadlines, the parades, and the protests, there was still the rhythm of daily existence, children at play, couples strolling hand in hand, vendors calling out their wares. It is in these small, unguarded moments that the decade becomes human, not just a collection of grand narratives but a lived experience shared by millions. In one photograph, a group of children play stickball in the middle of a crowded street. Their shoes are scuffed, their clothes patched, yet their laughter seems almost audible as they lean into the game, faces alight with concentration. Behind them, horse-drawn carts share space with shiny new automobiles, the clash of old and new life unfolding in the same frame. These images tell us that childhood in the 1920s was a blend of innocence and resilience, lived out in alleyways, on stoops, and in tenement yards where imagination made up for scarcity. Another photograph shows girls skipping rope on a sidewalk, their braids flying as bystanders pause to watch, smiles breaking across tired faces. In such photos, we glimpse the persistence of joy even amid hardship. Couples appear often in the photographs of the decade, captured in both posed portraits and fleeting candid shots. One rare image shows a young man and woman leaning against a lamppost, his arm draped casually around her shoulder as she smiles shyly at the camera. They are not flappers or gangsters or politicians, just two people enjoying a stolen moment of tenderness. Other photographs show couples walking in parks, sitting on benches, sharing ice cream cones outside corner shops. These quiet images remind us that even in an age of turbulence, romance endured, unremarkable yet profound in its simplicity. Love did not roar like jazz or march like protest, it whispered, steady and persistent, caught in photographs that speak across the decades. Street vendors were another constant presence, their photographs capturing the pulse of urban life. Men with pushcarts piled high with fruit, women selling flowers from baskets, children hawking newspapers with headlines blaring stories of prosperity and scandal. In one photograph, a man stands beside his cart loaded with pretzels, his face weathered but dignified, while a line of customers stretches down the block. In another, a boy no older than 12 holds stacks of papers as he shouts into the crowd, his small body dwarfed by the chaos of the city around him. These images tell us that everyday survival was woven into the fabric of city streets, where commerce, labor, and human connection met in the hum of daily exchange. Public spaces reveal themselves in countless photographs, parks filled with families on Sundays, beaches crowded with swimmers in modest bathing suits, amusement parks alive with rides and laughter. One particularly striking image shows rows of men in bathing costumes lined up on a pier, poised to dive into the water as onlookers cheer. Another captures the whirl of a carousel, children's faces blurred with delight. These photographs remind us that even in times of economic divide and cultural tension, leisure was not lost. People sought out escape, however brief, and the camera preserved those moments of release, where the weight of the world seemed to lift for a few hours. Workplaces also appear in the quieter photographs, showing not only factories and offices but small businesses that sustain neighborhoods. A shoemaker bends over his bench, his tools spread out around him, his hands steady as he repairs a sole. A seamstress sits by a window, light falling across her shoulders as she stitches carefully. A barber grins at the camera while trimming a customer's hair, his shop decorated with mirrors and posters. These are not the grand industrial images of progress but the intimate portraits of work as daily ritual, where skill and service gave shape to lives. They remind us that modernity was not only built in assembly lines but also in the humble shops that lined every block. Festivals and community gatherings bring another layer to the photographic record. In small towns, parades filled streets with floats, marching bands, and banners, while families lined sidewalks to cheer. Photographs of county fairs show farmers proudly displaying livestock, children clutching balloons, couples riding Ferris wheels under strings of lights. These images reveal continuity, traditions carried forward even as the wider world seemed to change at dizzying speed. The everyday life of communities was stitched together through these gatherings, and the photographs capture the pride, the laughter, and the small-town rhythms often overshadowed by urban noise. In homes, photographs tell intimate stories of ordinary evenings. Families sit together in living rooms, the glow of a lamp lighting faces as fathers read newspapers and mothers darned socks. Children sit cross-legged on rugs, listening to the crackle of a new radio or playing board games on the floor. Kitchens are photographed in moments of preparation, women stirring pots while children set the table. These images, humble and unremarkable at the time, now carry immense weight, for they remind us that the decade was lived not only in public spectacle but in private rituals of family life. History is made in parliaments and ballrooms, but it is also made in kitchens, bedrooms, and living rooms, where the rhythm of daily existence unfolds. Perhaps the most revealing photographs of everyday life are those that capture unposed humanity: a man asleep on a park bench in the heat of summer, a girl feeding pigeons on the steps of a library, a street musician playing violin for coins while passers-by pause to listen. These images are fragments of a forgotten world, yet they feel timeless. They tell us that beneath the headlines and the myths, people lived ordinary days filled with small joys and quiet struggles. They remind us that history is not only about movements and revolutions, but about the texture of daily life, moments that may seem insignificant yet carry the essence of a time. Looking at these rare photographs now, nearly a century later, we are reminded that the hidden side of the 1920s was not always dark or violent. It was also intimate, ordinary, human. The photographs show us children laughing in streets, lovers leaning into each other, families gathering around tables, vendors calling out to customers. They reveal a decade not only defined by excess or extremism but by the persistence of life itself, lived one day at a time. In these unguarded images, the noise of the roaring decade fades, and what remains is the quiet heartbeat of humanity, steady and enduring across the years. The 1920s were not only a decade of jazz, speakeasies, and skyscrapers, they were also an era of strangeness, of obsessions and fads that swept across communities and vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Rare photographs of these oddities survive, capturing moments so peculiar that they feel surreal today. They remind us that beneath the serious struggles and cultural awakenings of the decade, there was also a hunger for novelty, a fascination with the bizarre, and a willingness to embrace the eccentric. The hidden side of the 1920s is often found in these images, snapshots of human curiosity, desperation, and sometimes sheer absurdity. One of the strangest obsessions of the decade was flagpole sitting. Photographs show young men perched atop tall poles, hundreds of feet in the air, sometimes for days or even weeks at a time. In one rare image, a crowd gathers below to watch a sitter wrapped in blankets on a narrow platform, his legs dangling dangerously over the side. Another shows a teenager eating breakfast while suspended above a busy street, waiters hoisting up trays with ropes. This fad, bizarre as it seems, reflected both the daring spirit of the age and its appetite for spectacle. The photographs freeze the absurdity of it, the sheer impracticality, and yet also the crowd's fascination, their upturned faces mirroring society's need for distraction in a world still recovering from war. Dance marathons were another craze that filled the decade with both excitement and exhaustion. Rare photos capture couples locked in endless embraces, shuffling across dance floors for hours, sometimes days, without rest. In some images, women lean heavily on their partners, their feet dragging as judges look on with stopwatches. In others, contestants collapse mid-dance, carried out by attendants as spectators cheer. What seems at first like entertainment takes on a darker edge in the photographs, the exhaustion etched into faces, the desperation in eyes that reveal these contests were often less about fun and more about survival, with prize money drawing the unemployed and the destitute. These haunting photos show how the line between amusement and exploitation blurred, and how crowds found both fascination and cruelty in watching bodies pushed to their limits. Freak shows and sideshows also thrived in the 1920s, their photographs revealing the fascination with the unusual and the grotesque. Images show bearded ladies posing proudly, sword swallowers frozen mid-act, and performers with physical deformities presented as spectacles. One haunting photograph shows conjoined twins smiling at the camera, their expressions warm despite the stares they endured daily. Another captures a so-called human oddity sitting in a cage as curious onlookers peer in. These images tell us that while the decade prided itself on modernity, it also indulged in ancient fascinations with the abnormal, treating human difference as entertainment. Today, these photographs carry both the weight of exploitation and the dignity of performers who carved identities out of the roles society forced upon them. Medical oddities of the era also appear in rare photos, strange treatments, bizarre contraptions, and experiments that now seem shocking. Photographs show patients strapped into devices meant to cure everything from arthritis to mental illness, electric helmets, vibrating chairs, machines that look more like instruments of torture than medicine. In one particularly eerie image, a child stands inside a contraption that blasts ultraviolet light, her body glowing eerily as doctors look on. These photographs remind us that the 1920s, while a time of scientific progress, was also an age of quackery, where desperate people submitted to treatments that promised miracles and delivered little more than pain. The hidden side of modern medicine was often as strange as any circus act, preserved in photographs that look almost unreal today. Beauty contests swept across the decade, documented in countless photographs of young women standing in rows, numbers pinned to their swimsuits, their smiles fixed as judges looked on. Pageants celebrated ideals of beauty that were narrow and exclusionary, yet they fascinated the public, filling magazines and postcards. Rare images show contests for babies, dogs, and even vegetables, where pumpkins and cabbages were crowned winners alongside their human counterparts. These photos, half whimsical and half unsettling, reveal society's obsession with ranking and display, with turning life itself into competition. In the frozen smiles of contestants, we glimpse both ambition and vulnerability, the hidden pressures of a culture that demanded perfection on stage while ignoring the realities off it. Sports also produce strange moments, immortalized in rare photographs that capture both triumph and absurdity. Images show men wrestling alligators in staged spectacles, or boxers fighting blindfolded for the amusement of crowds. Another photograph captures a baseball game played on stilts, players wobbling as they swung bats and chased balls. These images remind us that entertainment often veered into the bizarre, driven by the public's insatiable hunger for novelty. The photos freeze the comedy and the danger, leaving us to wonder how much was sport and how much was desperate spectacle in an age where amusement was both an escape and a business. Even the world of fashion carried its oddities. Rare photographs show women in gas masks during bizarre fashion shows, models wearing dresses made of newspapers, or men parading in costumes that now look like caricatures of futurism. These experimental displays, often staged for photographers, reflect the era's fascination with both innovation and absurdity. They remind us that the 1920s were not only about elegance but about play, about pushing boundaries of taste and reason alike. One of the most unsettling collections of photographs from the 1920s shows spiritualist seances. Images reveal groups of men and women sitting in darkened rooms, hands clasped, eyes wide as supposed mediums conjured spirits. Some photographs show ghostly figures, double exposures that gave the illusion of apparitions, while others reveal floating tables or ectoplasm oozing from mouths, a spectacle created for the camera as much as for the seance. These images remind us of the desperation to believe, the hunger for connection with lost loved ones in the wake of war and influenza. Whether fraud or faith, the photographs capture a strange intersection of grief and performance, a haunting oddity that feels both tragic and surreal. Looking at these forgotten oddities today, we see a decade not only of progress and conflict but of eccentric escapes. The rare photographs of flagpole sitters, exhausted dancers, sideshow performers, beauty queens, and spiritualists tell us that the 1920s were filled with quirks as much as with crises. They remind us that human beings, no matter the era, crave novelty, spectacle, and distraction, sometimes at the cost of dignity or safety. The hidden side of the 1920s is not only found in politics or poverty but in the strange pursuits that defined leisure, in the oddities that made people laugh, gasp, or shake their heads. These images, frozen in time, show us that history is never only serious, it is also peculiar, unpredictable, and endlessly surprising. The photographs of the late 1920s, when viewed with the knowledge of what was to come, feel like silent warnings. They capture a society convinced of its own prosperity, dazzled by its own reflection, yet blind to the cracks spreading beneath its feet. Wall Street towers gleam in sunlight, stock tickers were in crowded offices, and brokers stand confidently on the steps of the New York Stock Exchange. Rare photographs freeze the optimism of the era, men in sharp suits smiling at cameras, women crowding department stores to buy on credit, advertisements plastered across streets promising endless abundance. But alongside these images are others, subtler and darker: farmers standing in empty fields, banks foreclosing on small businesses, and families already showing signs of strain. The seeds of the Great Depression were being sown in plain sight, and the photographs preserve both the glitter and the rot. One rare image shows a brokerage office filled with eager faces, men and women alike hunched over ticker tape machines, pencils scratching furiously as they tracked stock prices. The air looks tense even in stillness, a frenzy contained within narrow walls. Another photograph captures a long line of investors outside a brokerage house, waiting for updates, their faces a mixture of greed and fear. These were the years when ordinary people poured savings into the stock market, convinced that wealth was only a few investments away. The photos, when studied now, carry an eerie foreshadowing, optimism painted across faces that would soon be lined with despair. Credit, too, transformed the decade, and photographs tell its story with uncanny clarity. In department store archives, we find images of shoppers crowding counters, clerks wrapping boxes, signs advertising, "Buy now, pay later." Automobiles, radios, and household appliances filled photographs of family life, but many of these goods were purchased on credit that stretched beyond means. One haunting image shows a repossession wagon parked outside a modest home, furniture being loaded as children watch from the porch. Another shows stacks of unpaid bills photographed by banks as evidence, the neat columns of debt contrasting with the smiles captured in glossy consumer ads. The photographs make clear what history confirms: prosperity was often an illusion, built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Agriculture, the backbone of much of America, was already in crisis long before the crash of 1929. Rare photos show farmers dumping milk into ditches, unable to sell it for a price that covered costs, while others capture grain piled high in storage as markets collapsed. In one striking image, a farmer's wife stands outside a farmhouse with broken windows, her children barefoot in the dust at her feet. Their expressions tell of exhaustion that prosperity never touched. These photographs reveal that rural America was already living in depression throughout the decade, their struggles overlooked as cities celebrated. When the crash finally came, these communities were not shocked, they were simply dragged deeper into hardship they already knew too well. Banks, too, left their warnings in photographs. Images of proud bankers standing in front of grand marble institutions project confidence, but other photos show something different: long lines of depositors waiting nervously outside small-town banks after rumors of instability spread. These early runs, captured in photographs long before 1929, reveal the fragility of the financial system. Smiling bankers posing beside vaults full of cash contrast starkly with later images of locked doors and shuttered windows. The photographs expose the thin veneer of stability that fooled the public until it shattered completely. The disparity between rich and poor, so vividly captured in photographs of the decade, is perhaps the clearest sign of the coming collapse. On one side, images show lavish parties, men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns sipping champagne in hotel ballrooms, their laughter frozen by flashbulbs. On the other, photographs from the same years reveal workers on strike, families in breadlines during localized recessions, and tenements overflowing with people who never saw prosperity touch their lives. The contrast between these photographs is jarring, and together they form a visual truth: the roaring prosperity was never universal, and its imbalance made collapse inevitable. Speculation, immortalized in photographs of trading floors and ticker machines, was mirrored by another set of images: advertisements promising ordinary citizens a chance to get rich quick. Rare photos show storefronts offering investment clubs, where workers pooled money to buy stocks they barely understood. The pride in their faces as they posed for photographs tells a story of hope, but the shadows in those same images reveal the danger. They believed photographs would record their rise, but instead they became evidence of misplaced faith in a system built to collapse. Even leisure photographs of the late 1920s carry hints of coming tragedy. Families posing with new cars, vacations at beaches, or tickets to Broadway plays, all financed on optimism, credit, and speculation. One particularly haunting photo shows a group of friends clinking glasses at a rooftop party in 1928, the skyline glowing behind them. They look carefree, timeless in their joy, yet history tells us that within a year many of them would see their fortunes vanish. These photographs are not just records of joy, they are frozen moments on the edge of disaster, laughter echoing before the silence of collapse. When the crash came in October 1929, the photographs became even more stark. Brokers standing in streets with dazed expressions, piles of paper strewn across trading floors, police holding back crowds outside banks. Rare images show men with their heads in their hands, others staring at chalkboards where plummeting prices were scrawled in real time. Some photographs capture the despair in human form, individuals who lost everything in a single day, their faces marked with shock. Though many of these photos were taken at the end of the decade, they feel like the inevitable conclusion to all the images that came before, the silent warnings ignored until it was too late. Looking at these rare photographs now, nearly a century later, we see not just the glamour and optimism of the 1920s but the fragility beneath it. The decade's hidden side was the instability lurking behind every smile, every new purchase, every stock investment. The photographs remind us that prosperity can be an illusion, that societies often dance at the edge of collapse without realizing it. The seeds of the Great Depression were not invisible, they were captured in plain sight, in the smiles of overconfident investors, in the desperation of farmers, in the thin lines of depositors outside shaky banks. History preserved these moments in black and white, and they remain as warnings written in light and shadow. Prosperity built on imbalance cannot last, and the camera never lies.